As they wish. Hello, so thank you everyone for joining us today for today's Digital Theatre Masterclass, which is being all put together and run and organised by the wonderful Bartek Pakova, who is of Seven Hills Films and also has done all of the wonderful Beam Empty Spotlights filming for us last year. If you don't know me, my name is Ellen, and this is my last event as the MMD MTN Membership and Communications Manager. And I've got some visitors in the office and some faces making sad. It's okay. I'll always just be a text and an email and a Zoom away. But we're really delighted to kind of be picking Bartek's brains and expertise this afternoon in this free panel. And we will be covering about 5 different topics. And we've got time for Q&A at each point, and then also time for Q&A at the end if we've missed anything in particular or if you'd like to share anything. And I'd probably recommend at some point, Bartek, maybe we take a bit of a screen break, but we'll see how we go. We'll see how many questions there are, if everyone needs a loo or a tea break, and then go from there. Bartek, over to you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Bartek. I do lots of different video-related things, some of which are also theater-related, but not all. And basically, I'm going to try and put a lot of these things together today so that you get some kind of an idea of what you can do when taking theater digital. Ellen, quick question. Just to double check, I don't see the participants, right?
Would you like to be seeing the participants? So because we're recording now,
not necessarily.
It's up to them.
Yeah,
but I think as we come to kind of questions and so on, if you do want to kind of turn your camera on or off and come and give us a wave, so that you can get our attention. You can also use the chat to grab mine or Bartek's attention. I'll be monitoring that as Bartek takes us through everything. But do, come and chat to us as we go through things. We'll just let Bartek kind of spurt his wisdom and see where we end up. It is a little bit like Bartek's been writing pages and pages and pages of notes and has been very excited to do this. And this is all his idea, and he's doing it all for free to teach all the people. So we thank you, Bartek, always.
You're welcome. Now I'm just trying to... Unfortunately, windows and multiple windows don't work very well. Ironically. Right, let me just move this, because right now I'm seeing Ellen on a huge screen, and now I'm seeing myself on a huge screen. But I will figure that out.
There's a setting which everyone may find useful, that there is a hide self-view setting. So you don't have to look at your own face. That's my biggest problem on a Zoom, is I just keep looking at myself. But now I get to look at Bartek.
But
so that's
for me, it will be somewhat
tip.
useful. For me, it will be somewhat useful because I will kind of know what's actually in the Zoom. Right. So let's get started. So what I would actually like to start is a quick overview of different forms of digital theater.
Should we mention the kind of 5 areas we'll start with as well? So
we're
doing overview of digital theater, and then what's the next couple of topics, just so everyone knows what they're in for?
Topics are practical examples, then sound in the digital realm, cameras, and post-production.
Perfect. So there's your kind of banner headings of each things we're going through.
And we'll kind of start with the more kind of creative stuff, then we'll go into the more technical stuff, and then we'll build up on that and go into more creative stuff. So once I start talking about the technical stuff, don't mute me, don't tune out, don't leave.
I won't mute you.
There's a purpose for all of that. And I won't be going too deep into these topics, because this is more about kind of a broad overview of everything. And obviously we have limited time. So there's only so much I can say. Right, so for the purposes of this discussion, whenever I say live stream, I will mean something that's being streamed as it's happening, whereas VOD or video on demand will be something that's streamed after the fact. It's not strictly correct, but it'll be a little bit easier if I have to mention one or the other. to delineate things like this. Right. So, over the last 2 years or however long it's been, you've all seen a lot of different types of digital theater. So you have, for example, let me just fade this. You have shows that are filmed and streamed. Oops, forgot that this is giving sound. Right, forgot to mute that. Right, so you've got shows that are filmed and streamed with an audience. And if I were to zoom in and brighten this, well, you might actually see, if you've got a bright enough screen, someone's leg down there on the left. So that's something that a lot of you have probably experienced. And this is, in many ways, the closest to traditional theater, in that the setting is the same, the audience is in there, and that both creates familiarity and creates certain limitations. So another option, which, let's see if I can pull it in. No, I don't have a screenshot pulled in here. I think I said it to download. Doesn't matter. So another option is actually very similar, which is a show that's put on in a theater as well, run all the way through, but without an audience. And that is very similar, but it does create some more possibilities, because obviously you've got more space, but also you can point the cameras in places where normally it might be a little bit awkward, because you would be showing the faces of everyone in the audience just as much as you would be showing your actors. And then a variation of that is what I kind of called in my notes fragmented filming in a theater setting. So this is a bit more of a cross between traditional theater, in that you're still using that same setting, the same lighting techniques, etc., but you're filming it in chunks the way you would film a movie or a TV show. But unlike a movie or a TV show, you would usually do it scene by scene. Whereas a movie or a TV show is shot by shot, and not only are the scenes not necessarily in order, but also the shots themselves might be completely out of order. And then the final type is filming or streaming in a non-traditional setting, and the file that I wanted has downloaded, and let me just make sure that this one doesn't necessarily play straight away, because by default it does. Right, so you can, for example, have a show in a park like this, which can be very problematic, but it is an interesting option, and it does create a very different setting, create a very different space. It has a very different feel that something in a closed room. Another option, which I don't have a screenshot for either, but you're all too familiar with, is a Zoom show, where you basically have actors calling in and speaking or perhaps singing over Zoom. And that obviously removes barriers such as the different locations that the actors might be in, but also usually doesn't look that great. Right, so those are kind of the main types of digital theater. And let me just go back to me for now. Okay. So obviously with things opening up more and more, and hopefully the whole pandemic shortly being over, there is a question of whether it still makes sense to do the things that we were doing during the pandemic when it comes to digital theater. Does it make sense to do shows on Zoom? Does it make sense to live stream everything? And in my opinion, absolutely yes. First of all,
I mean, this is the question, isn't it? Do you think it's here to stay, Bartek? Because I know that this has been something
I don't
that's,
know. Mhm.
is it here to
Go on.
stay? Is it here to stay as it is? I mean, digital theatre in its forms were around prior to the pandemic as well. We just, obviously became much more accessible in a normal place. What do we think is the future of this? Or am I jumping the gun? Am I getting too excited?
No, it's fine. So I don't know whether it's here to stay. I mean, those things do tend to be quite unpredictable, but in my opinion, it should absolutely still be a thing. So first of all, audience reach. It's not limited by location. I mean, if someone doesn't live in London and wants to see a show in London, that will end up costing them a lot of money. Not just for the show itself, but they also need to get to London. Maybe they have to stay somewhere overnight. They have to get some food. It all adds up. Compared to the cost of a ticket for a live stream or a video on demand show, well, it's a lot more if you have to actually make your way there. And perhaps you want to see a show that's actually being shown in a different country. Then obviously those costs end up being even higher, and it takes more time, etc., etc. It's not necessarily practical. So, for example, when we were doing before after at the Southwark Playhouse, a lot of the audience. That show, by the way, was completely live streamed. There was no audience in the room, and a lot of virtual audience was from Japan. I doubt most of them would be able to fly over to London to see the show. So it's great for the audience, but I do also think it's great for the creatives and for theaters, because it doesn't mean that you can't have in-person audience. It just means that you can have an additional audience. So I think it's great for everyone in that regard. Also, audience size is not limited by venue size. There are certain limitations on audience size in streaming, but most of the time you don't really have to worry about it, because very often, if you're streaming a show, you will be using a service that will take care of those things for you. And if they have a limit for the number of people, they will let you know, or at least they should let you know. Right. Given the non-traditional settings that I mentioned, you might also be less reliant on venue availability cost. I mean, it's perfectly possible to do a nearly zero budget show digitally, because there are free tools available for streaming. There are free platforms like YouTube. It might not necessarily be as straightforward to immediately monetize it, but if you're just starting out and you want to find an audience, maybe you want to workshop something, I think that's a viable method of doing it.
And I think it definitely helps with that. I know that when people are workshopping at the moment, but even pre-pandemic, we were finding it's still so very difficult to get everyone in a room together, whether it's in London, outside of London, anywhere. That even the idea of recording, let alone live streaming, but even just any form of recording or filming is definitely becoming more commonplace. It just gives you assets to work with in the future, as well as like a greater reach, like overall. And you can create anything out of it. Like once you have a digital asset, we can make social media content, poster content, photos, everything. It helps attract investors. It is really, it's something that when I'm working on projects, I always consider investing in very much. For me, I think it's worth it. And so it'd be great to explore with Bartek today the things that we can do on our own versus the things that we can do with the help of a professional or by investing in some equipment or some editing to kind of go through it all and go to what limits we can work within, because I always think a recording is a good investment. But
yeah, and you actually partly covered my next point, which is video on demand opportunities. I mean, if you film your show, then after the run is over, that show can still keep working in a way by being offered as video on demand, which I think is a great thing for producers to consider. Because obviously, once you've put on a show, most of your costs will have been spent, and you still have that digital copy of the show that you can offer to people online. Right. And the last opportunity that I think is still not being fully utilized, because all of the previous things, I mean, they had to be done during the pandemic. And yeah, different shows utilize them to a different degree, but they're kind of all reasonably obvious things. But I think something that's not necessarily being used to its full extent, at least not very commonly, is borrowing from the language of film to tell stories in new ways. So I remember there have been a few discussions, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, about whether a show, whether it's still theater if it's being filmed, if it's not being seen live, and what actually makes it theater. And I've got some ideas about kind of what, at least from my point of view, makes theater theater. But I also think that it absolutely doesn't matter, because ultimately, both theater and film are about telling stories that we care about for one reason or another in a way that works for us because we enjoy that way of telling stories, or it just feels natural to us, or maybe it's more accessible to us for some reason. And everything else is just about which tool you use to tell the story. And there's no reason not to borrow tools from theater when you're making films. And this is kind of not even getting into everything that kind of is built into film that draws on theater. But I'm thinking about films like Birdman, for example, where you had a fake single shot following the characters actually through a theater. And to me, that even though they're moving onto the stage and they're backstage a lot, that does borrow from theater a lot. There's also Dogville, which had extremely minimalistic production design, which was much more theatrical than filmic. So obviously movies borrow from theater all the time, and I don't see why theater can borrow from movies all the time. There have been shows that have used cameras and projected images from them inside a theater. And yeah, the more of these tools everyone knows, the more choice they have. Because ultimately, it's not that different.
I was going to say some examples that immediately come to mind is I know that Bad Out of Hell used camera on stage and projected. I know that American Idiot has used it. So I know it's a lot of the newer shows. Do you have any more examples that we can share?
Not off the top of my head. I'm better with film examples than theater examples, to be
Definitely,
honest.
but I think there's lots of examples of people using either even pre-recorded or recorded live, or you kind of camera to project a link up.
Yeah, and I think that's still kind of very often stage one of how you can incorporate things. Because just like theater has its own language that's very rich, and you can have a career in theater for several decades and still not use certain tools. It's the same in film. And film is still developing in many ways. I mean, it's obviously a much younger art form than theater. So I think it's definitely worth borrowing, whether you're in film borrowing from theater, whether you're in theater borrowing from film. Especially since very often they actually try to accomplish similar things using different methods. I mean, both theater and film mess around with time and space the entire time. I mean, if you're on stage, you may walk through a doorway and suddenly find yourself in a different country, whereas in film, you can walk out of one door, cut, you're in a different country.
So are there more tools specifically when you're talking here, Bartek, about, so Julie's asked in the chat, specifically what the tools you think we could borrow from film and theatre and kind of working together. So we've got time and the movement of time and how we portray that. What else have we got?
So I will be talking about some of them in the next section, some technical aspects throughout it. So I'll cover some of these points.
Yeah, definitely.
And if there are any more questions after that, then absolutely. Go ahead. Okay.
It sounds like we've got some kind of technical tools and so on, but we might also come across some narrative-y tools or like devices that we could use. For those who don't know, Bartek has written many a screenplay, a film, is also a director of cinematography, so he does also speak to kind of how do we do the thing and how we convey it, as well as in the technical of what and how.
There will be some practical examples that I will be showing even. Right. So that was a bit of a rant. Ellen knew that I would be ranting from time to time.
It's not just rant, but we just ensure that there's, you know, a bit of back and forth and so on. And so if anyone is welcome to jump in and kind of either put their hand up or say, can I come and ask a question, or you can pop it in the chat and I can jump in. It's up to you.
There will actually be a question break soon.
Yes, we'll do a question break kind of at each topic. So Bartek will stop us, and we can also, if we need a bit of a screen break or a fatigue break, I'd suggest we kind of have one at least on the hour, but also as need be. And do remember that we are recording this. And I'll just say again, we are recording this, and we'll also arrange for a transcript to be done just so it's available to everyone. So you will have those if you do need to take a moment. Onwards.
Okay. Right. So I'll actually go to the next. Yeah, I'll cover the next point before in a slightly different order. Right. So this is actually directly related to those tools that we can borrow from film. So one thing that we can do is we can connect disjointed spaces. So I'm kind of going to have to walk over somewhere else. Hopefully my really massively extended headphone cable will be enough. So normally you would do this with several people, but I'm on my own here, so I'll have to walk over to a different part of this flat. Try not to trip over any of the cables that I have here. And is this number 2? Yeah, that is number 2. So I'll come back here a bit more later. But yeah, you could easily have a live show where you're switching between multiple different rooms in a flat or in a theater. I mean, you could easily use 2 different rooms in a theater, or you could use a corridor wherever you want. And switching is as simple as this. You could have one actor in one space, one actor in another. And that will feel in many ways like film, but at the same time, well, if you're doing it completely live and maybe even you're even setting it in a theater, then is it not theater? Again, I don't really think that matters too much. Right, let me just drag
and so Bartek, was that
here.
Just, sorry, I've got a bit in the office, but was that as just showing the switches, or did we demonstrate how one switches between the 2 cameras with the magical cable? Is that what we're getting to?
So I can talk a little bit in a few moments about the technicalities of it. For now, I kind of mostly wanted to talk about the techniques kind of more
Perfect.
in the creative sense.
Yeah, of course.
That's kind of the idea there is that we can connect disjointed spaces, and you could more or less easily have cameras in every room of a house, and you could have a play that takes place in a house, and you follow the characters through the different rooms. There are obviously budgetary limitations because the more cameras you have, more cameras you have to hire or buy, but also you need to wire it all up. And I'll talk a little bit more about how it's wired up later. If I forget, do remind me. Right, so let me just make sure that this is muted. Okay. So another option, basically the reverse of that, is breaking up a large space. So I've got Preludes here, which we did at Saverick Playhouse, and all of this was done in one room. I think we used the little, although honestly I can't even remember at this point. I think it was the little. But the main thing is that even though we have multiple angles here, and it looks like we have multiple spaces, so there's this little corner space, and then there's this space, and there's also a piano in the background, although it's not lit at this point. This was all done in a single space. And we basically set up the cameras in a way that allowed things to be split up, and that was actually, in terms of that division of the space, that was all figured out by Alex Sutton, who directed the show. So that is another option. Oh yeah, so here's the piano shot. So it's kind of 2.5 spaces. The corner space, this main space, and then there's a different angle on the piano. Right. So that is another possibility. And you kind of have 2 rooms or more without having to put up walls. You just angle your cameras properly and plan your lighting so that you're lighting the 2 parts of the space separately. Right. So let's see this. Oh yeah, so this is actually the copy of the show that I wanted. I just need to figure out, the one thing that I didn't write down is the time code for a cool thing that we did in post-production, so I might not be able to find it easily. Let me just quickly...
And to clarify, like, so Bartek is currently plugged in his entire server to the computer to save him from having to download all of the various films.
This I did download from my Google Drive. But yeah, there's a cool effect at one point here, but I'll actually show it differently so that I'm not wasting time scrolling through it. So let's see if so I wasn't going to show this piece of software for a while. I'll talk about this a fair bit later. So there will be more explanations. Now I won't be saving it. So another thing that you can borrow from film are various visual effects. And I'll probably pick a very stupid one. Yeah. Like night vision. So the thing that I actually originally wanted to find from this show was a really cool glitch, which wasn't this one, but yeah, I think this one is pretty slow. Okay, yeah. So you've got glitches like this. It's playing back a bit slowly now because it has to calculate all the glitches. So you can borrow techniques like this from film once you go digital. There's also another, let me cut back here. another thing in terms of the techniques that you can borrow, which is the control over the point of view. Ah, there it was. See, so in this show, there are, let me just play it for a bit, and maybe we'll reach the right point. So in this shot in particular, which was kind of our, did I just hear piano? I don't know where that came from. So in this particular show, this was kind of our main space, but there were also close-up shots on Rach, the main character. So having the exit zoom sound. Oh yeah, I am getting zoom sounds. That is true. So one of the opportunities that you get with cameras that I will discuss a bit more later, in the next section, in fact, is that you can control the audience's point of view. So obviously, if you're in a theater, the point of view of each audience member is wherever they're sitting. Yes, Julie, there is a free version of DaVinci. I will talk about DaVinci in detail much later. So I will mention this. Right. So so in theater, the point of view of each audience member is different, and you have no control over it beyond maybe deciding that, well, you want the audience on both sides of the stage. So you have some general control, but nothing specific. Whereas once you use cameras, you can decide that, well, in this particular moment, you want a close-up on the character, and this is what you want everyone in the audience to see. And perhaps you want to do this to emphasize this character, or maybe you simply want to hide something from the audience that's off camera at that point. Maybe someone, I'll actually show it here, because I have much more control over scrolling when I'm in Resolve. Yeah. So
Bartek saying that you've got like a narrative element of
exactly.
You can pull in close on the face of the emotions and so on, which is obviously much harder to do in the theatre. But then also you've got the technical elements of going, well, this is actually covering, oh, quick, we're running a prof off or anything. So you've got both reasons as well as just variety and depth. And
so there are technical reasons for hiding things, but they could also be creative, because maybe you want some kind of a surprise element. Maybe one character is talking to another. You switch to a close-up of the character who's talking, and then when you switch back to the wide shot, the other character is gone. I mean, that's something that could be used. So here, we don't use any tricks, but we do, at a certain point, switch to a close-up of the main character. Right. Obviously, there's more than just switching to a close-up that gives you control over the point of view. And in a way, it's more of the theatrical elements that are being borrowed in film. For example, Spielberg is known for using wide shots a lot more than most other directors, and just composing them to draw the eye somewhere. And that's actually that's actually the easiest way, well, the simplest way to judge a well-composed shot. Does it draw the eye where it should draw it? And that will use things like blocking, lighting, and so on. And those will be executed slightly differently in film than in theater, but they are just variations of the same thing.
Bartek, have you seen the new West Side Story? This was like a fun point to put it in.
I have.
And how do you feel about the cinematography of West Side Story at the moment?
I think it's great.
I think it's really interesting, because this is where we find the differences between film and theatre, but also the transition of theatre to film. Do you think that the depth used and the way that it was filmed best matched the choreography? When I was watching it, it felt you know, because it was Spielberg, wasn't it? So Spielberg's
Yeah.
known for those huge panoramas or those really wide shots. And for me as a musical theatre nut, I felt a little bit like, actually, that was a stunning shot, but I can't see the feet, and we're in a tap dance number. And it, like, you know, so there's that interesting juxtaposition of beautiful
Yeah.
shot versus capturing action, and where you go
So,
from
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, to just, you know, what do you think of that?
Well, whenever you direct something, you have, or at least you should have a point of view. If you don't have a point of view, it's probably not going to go very well. And I mean, this was Spielberg's first musical, and he has directed a lot of films over the
And
years.
very good films.
Yeah, yeah. So I think part of that might be that he just looks at things slightly differently than someone who's very immersed in theater would. And there are different things that uh, his attention is drawn to. And some people like it, some people won't. I mean, uh, that's why it's impossible to say who the best director, whether it's in theater or in film, is, because every director makes certain choices based on what they're directing, but also based on who they are. And some people will like those choices, some people won't. I mean, there are certain films that are nominated for Best Film Oscar that I think are absolute rubbish. And yeah. So
Yeah.
basically, I think that that might be something that you or anyone else who's very immersed in theater would spot immediately, and that
Yeah.
bothers them or matters to them. But it might not necessarily bother someone who's more film oriented quite as much. And I mean, there are
Definitely.
obviously a lot of people who cross over between one and the other.
And there's lots of arguments we could make about those choices and so on.
Yeah.
Are we about 1, 2 topics through? Do we want to do a quick question break?
We're nearly at
Nearly
the end. I will
to,
show
yeah.
one more thing.
Yeah, and then I mean, I've got a
mhm.
question, but if anyone's got a
Yeah.
question after this chunk,
But just to finish off
of
the
course.
Spielberg part, whenever you're making a film, you will be leaving certain things out because you are limiting what the audience sees to the frame. So it's always a choice, and it's basically what matters to you and what you think will tell the story best. But it doesn't mean that that is the absolute truth. I mean, I doubt there's a single film that has ever been made that couldn't be made differently and still be really good. Maybe not the same people would like it, but it could still be really, really good, but different. So there are always choices, there are always things that you leave out. Right, so those were kind of the more film tools, and very briefly, if you're dealing with maybe not necessarily film-inspired digital theater, then you can use things like transitions. So you've obviously seen me fade between different elements, and the other screen could easily be someone else. Let's actually switch between me and someone else. So we can do that, but you could, if you wanted to, go crazy with transitions and do things like this. And actually, if you think about it, wipes were used a lot in Star Wars, so that is kind of a film technique, maybe.
Give me Windows 95 star wipe or death.
Do I have a star wipe?
I don't think
no.
anyone still has a star wipe. It's a very 90s
What's a
technique.
slide reverse? I don't know. I mean, most of these I don't use. Most of the time, it's a fade or a merge. But
it's something that's definitely harder to do in
Yeah.
a theater. That's your kind of blackout
yeah.
or
So it's like
your padding, your vamp.
the thing is that it's possible that tools like this won't really matter to you 9 times out of 10, but you might have a show that's done completely digitally, that's set in a time period that needs cheesy transitions like that. I mean, it's all available. It doesn't all just have to be cut, cut, or fade, fade. There are more tools, and you can actually build up your own transitions. I mean, I don't think. Ooh, can I actually add one here? I don't have any added here, but there's a thing called a stinger. So you've probably seen stingers on TV. It can basically be a graphical element that goes across the screen, hiding the current shot and revealing another one. So that's something that you can also use, and those you can custom build to fit your show.
Kind of like a logo transition, or like having something that's on top, isn't it?
Yeah. And obviously you can also create, let me just build something very quickly. So I need a black background, and I need myself, and I need a show, and I need both of them visible, and ta-da. So yeah, you can obviously combine different elements like this, and it doesn't have to be a live or a pre-recorded video. It can, for example, be something like this. Let's add that, and on top, yeah. So maybe your show takes place at a TV station, and you'll want to add elements like this because one of the characters is a newscaster. So that is all possible.
And I think that all looks really great. Is that the right moment?
I think that's, yeah. So kind of, I'll just add one sentence, which is basically that I'll actually reuse an image from later on in the discussion. So you can build things up. You can essentially build a virtual set. You can incorporate images and put them wherever you want. And there is actually a function called a virtual set, but I've never actually used it because I don't know, I never had the need to, but there is actually the option to even, let's say, put a green screen behind me, make that green screen transparent in the software, and put me in some kind of a space. So it could be somewhere outside. Basically think of it as a set that you would have in a theater, but just represented digitally, and you can change it throughout the show. Yeah, like what Alan is doing now.
Something a little bit like this.
Yeah.
Although I think it's much more intelligent when you use an actual green screen rather than the little zoomy, because you'll find that we get the disappearing effect. But Zoom does it all right.
Zoom has to figure out what's you and what's not you. What a green screen does is it pretty much tells the software what to remove. There's a little bit more to that, but the whole purpose behind a green screen or a blue screen, depending on what you need, is to make it as easy as possible to remove everything except for what you need. But I mean, technology has progressed like crazy over the last few years, and like NVIDIA graphics cards have some really crazy AI-driven stuff built in for removing backgrounds, denoising, etc. Yeah, there's a lot that can be done.
But I think still not quite. We have the software that allows us to sing to each other in real time on a Zoom, but we'll get to audio. I think audio is our next topic, isn't it?
I mean, if you want, I can talk briefly later about why it's actually impossible to sing over Zoom.
Let's just check that anyone doesn't have any questions at the moment. I mean, if there are no questions, then please feel free to jump on and say hello, or to go, here's my screen and so on. You can pop it in the chat. You can do whatever. But if not, I might dob in Hilmi, who I know is on the call, if he's still there. I know that Hilmi has made some digital theatre recently, and so Hilmi will often work with Adam Lenson and Chris Chorney. They're called Theatrical Solutions, and they did a piece called Shift Alt Right. And you've done some other digital stuff as well, but that was specifically a piece designed for digital. So did you find that you were using any of the cinematic techniques or the things that Bartek has said, or anything else you'd like to add, Hilmi? I'm going to pop you on the spot there.
Hello. Hi, Ellen.
Hey.
Hi, Bartek.
Hey, Hilmi.
Uh, yeah, I'm not really sure what to add. I think, like you said, Adam and Chris handled the technical side of it, and it was Adam as a director is the person who made it look the way it looked. So it didn't look like Zoom theater at all. It looked like what Bartek was saying. It looked more like a cross between TV and theater, or movies and theater, because it had sort of uh, that the camera wasn't looking into his face, into the actors' faces. It was looking at various angles at the actor. But yeah, as a writer, I have to say I more deal with the other questions that are not we're not talking about today, which is what makes digital theater in terms of artistically, in terms of why does digital theater exist, which is sort of a very, very new conversation that's sort of being had mostly on Twitter and discourse amongst digital artists, but it's not a conversation that is being had widely at all. It's not a conversation that theaters are having. It's purely independent artists having it. And yeah, there's a lot to talk about, a lot to debate about. But yeah, it's sort of a topic for another day. But basically, in my opinion, digital theater, if digital theater is ever to become ever to survive the pandemic, we need to start thinking of it as its own medium, as opposed to being a replacement or a substitute for theater. So it's yeah, digital theater is not just, oh, I had a play, I had a musical that was going to be performed, and now the audience can't be there because of COVID, so we're just going to stream it, which is kind of like a stopgap. Whereas as an artist, I'm sort of approaching it as, how can I make something that can only exist on people's screens at home, whilst also being live, whilst also being theater, insofar as that what they experience is, maintaining that connection between the audience member and the people on stage, as they would in a theater, but through screens. So it's sort of a different conversation, as you've both already said up front. But yeah.
I think Hilmi and I might try to organize that we have that conversation at some point as well, to kind of talk about the really artistic things as well, because I know that Bartek is kind of a cinematographer, and this comes to my next question as well, but you've got that I'm the director of the cinema or the film or the digital product, but then you may also have that director of the stage show or the stage version. And then what Hilmi's kind of saying is, there is an art form that exists in the middle here, or that can exist specifically for this medium. And it's such an exciting space. I mean, I've just recently finished a producing course where a colleague of mine is one of the first digital stage managers, and we're talking from the early 2000s. Digital theatre has actually been around for quite a while, but it's obviously hit this point of mass saturation and accessibility as well because of the pandemic, and all of a sudden we're all very good at video calls and so on. Yes, and Joyce has asked the eternal question, which we might have to get to.
Can I quickly say about that, Joyce?
Yeah, definitely, Hilmi.
With Shift All Right, the show we made. So it was it was a musical I wrote as soon as lockdown started, basically in April, and then we staged it in October the same year. We sold 300 tickets, and we broke even. And that there's no way in hell we would have broke even if that had been a stage musical. So digital musicals have really broken open the conversation of how can we make musicals when we're not rich, basically. How can we make musicals when we don't have rich friends or rich producers? Just because doing a digital musical cuts out all sorts of costs, like venue costs, if you're brave enough to host it in your flat, which is what we did. And it cuts out. So the musicians were pre-recorded, so we paid them an upfront fee rather than paying them to work over the week, because again, like Ellen and Bartek have said, it's nearly impossible to have musicians, and it's nearly impossible to have more than one moving part live. I know that there is this online app that you can use where musicians can jam with each other, but I know that's very buggy and it's not it's not reliable enough for music.
And you're still limited.
And the second that my internet drops out, you know, it just doesn't quite.
The furthest you can have someone else. If you're in London, you can play with someone in Paris if your connection is very, very stable. But it will be audio only. But Edinburgh is actually too far. Edinburgh is just a tiny bit too far. So this, it's actually physics. So the signal takes so long to travel from one place to the other. And there's also some overhead because it has to go to your internet service provider and so on and so on. But ultimately, it does actually take time for the signal to go from one place to the other. And for a musician, anything above 30 milliseconds is clearly no longer in sync. I bet that for like a high-end drummer, it's even lower than 30 milliseconds.
So there you go, a bit of a science lesson as well as our music creativity tech lesson. Bartek
I should have a tablet and draw things.
Bartek does actually have, I believe, multiple scientific degrees before deciding to make film.
Not as many as the screens, but yes.
I think, thank you, Hilmi. It's really great to hear a bit of a practical example as well to share that like it can be done. And I think looking at Joyce's question and also Chris's questions earlier in terms of how do we actually make it financially viable or contracts or so on, I think that is going to have to be part of a bigger conversation that we have. But let's see if we can come back to it a little bit towards the end, because today was really focusing on the tech, and kind of what we do in that space. But I think let's definitely try to do another call or another masterclass on the other things. So I've worked for Original Theatre Company for about 2-3 years now in developing their online platform since the start of the pandemic, which very much became let's film, let's stream, let's archive our filmed recordings, and has become let's make a bit more of a digital art form. So I think there's another conversation that we can have and we can keep having in this space as well. Did anyone have any other questions for Bartek kind of around forms of digital theatre and then digital cinematic-y kind of techniques that we can take into theatre if we're thinking digitally? Before, I think the next topic was it audio?
No. The next topic are practical examples.
Aha. If there's no more, we might crack on with practical examples. And then after practical examples, we might take a couple of minute tea break just so everyone can have a bit of a rest. And then we'll keep going if that works for everyone.
In that case, I'm just going to very quickly check one thing. I've got many different shows in front of me right now, so I'll just queue something up. I do actually have to download some stuff. The stuff that I don't have to download is for later. So I'll queue that up, and I'll have to remember most of my notes because I won't have my notes there. And once again, I need to make sure that I don't trip, because that would be both embarrassing and quite destructive. There will be a behind-the-scenes look at all of this later. Okay, so this. Am I on the screen? Huh. Why is my screen black? Sorry, 1 second. This is the problem with being on multiple. Oh, why is this disconnected?
Bartek, we have a black.
Yeah, I know.
Are we?
Oh, I know why. Now, where's the stupid button?
Ooh, kitchen.
Awesome. I just accidentally clicked a button that I never use, and now I know why some people have actually 3D printed a cover for it. Because it's very annoying.
This is where we all learn together a little bit. This is where Bartek shows us his cables.
This is why normally you have more than one person doing all of this. Normally, you would have at least 3 people in this room, not 1. Right. Practical example. Ignore this light. I was going to use it, but in the end, I didn't. I didn't have time to get rid of it. That should be a bit better. This actually connects nicely to what Hilmi was talking about, because this is basically a setup for a potential scene in a flat. And I kind of lit it with just one person in one place in mind, partly due to time constraints and partly because there's only me here anyway. You could easily have me talking to another person. Obviously, I would have to light it slightly differently. But yeah, so you could have a simple kitchen scene, could do some cooking and so on, and then I'll kind of have to go back and forth. So this is, I might be slightly out of focus, but yeah, focusing when I'm not in shot is nearly impossible. So this is something that you could do in the middle of the scene, just switch to a different angle. I'm still in the exact same position that I was. I do have to kind of lean in and out to switch this, unfortunately. This is mostly because the cables aren't long enough. Well, actually, now we might be. No, we're probably still not. I've got way too many cables here. Right. This is kind of a simple example of how you can use an existing room and, for the most part, existing lighting to create a scene. And you don't necessarily have to focus on people's faces. You can have their hands, or you can have props in shot. I have no idea if this is in focus. And obviously, in a not insane setup like this, you would have someone else operating this, and the actor wouldn't have to constantly lean in and out, interrupting the flow of the whole thing. So kind of to give you an idea of what I actually did here practically, I pretty much mostly, other than the cameras, I mostly stuck to the stuff that I already have here. So all of these lights are built in, which in film speak is called a practical light. So a practical light is any light that's in the shot, whether it's a pre-existing light or a kind of normal, regular person light, or a film light. If it's in shot, it's a practical light, and unless it's an accident. As long as it's deliberately in shot. This, on the other hand, is an actual film light. And the reason why I did it like this was because those kind of look sort of more or less okay and create some kind of depth. And if I wanted to use film lights, I would have to use tiny little lights, squeeze them in here. It would have taken me ages. So I just used what I had. Whereas this light is a film light, because if I was just using standard overhead lights, let me actually switch them on for a second. If I can reach the switch.
That's where Bartek needs to get the clappers.
Yeah, that's where I need to get a longer cable. Okay, so now that's on, that's off.
See the shadow?
So this kind of sucks. Well, let's see if I can make it a little bit better by switching on my last house light. And I'm back here. And this still kind of sucks. I mean, partly because this light is covering this, but if I stand even directly in front of that light, this is not a very good look. I would not pay to watch something like this.
And I think for those of us who don't have film lights, you know, I use a lamp at my desk. I use like a desk lamp, a bendy desk lamp, bendy floor lamps, all variety of different lamps kind of things, or just being aware and mindful and pointing your light, or not using windows. There's ways that we don't need a film light to do this as well.
So it's more about control than it is about what kind of a light you're using. I mean, honestly, like, this is not a very expensive lighting panel, but even that, if I was on a budget and couldn't even rent it, I could replace it with something else. Because all that's doing is it provides kind of soft light that's above me and has a little grid so that that light doesn't go too far back. So you can see if I move my hand too far back, there's no more light here, and that's so that these don't get too bright and so that there's a little bit of a contrast. So you can actually see how if I'm out of the light, I kind of blend in with the background a lot. And if those cabinets were too bright, I would still be blending in. I would just be blending in while being brighter. So yeah, things like this can be improvised, and honestly, there are more YouTube channels about improvising lights than I could mention in 2 hours. So if you don't have a budget, but you want to set something in a flat and you know that you have to manipulate the lighting at least a little bit, go on YouTube. There you will find lots of help there. It'll literally be stuff like, okay, so buy this £5 light bulb and a shower curtain and use a broomstick. And that will help you with a lot of stuff. On the other hand, if you do have a little bit of a budget, there are also other tricks that you might not necessarily think of immediately, like if you have a light like this, or I mean actually a little light like this, which is kind of a bit of a spotlight, although not exactly. Is that connected? Should be connected. Yay. So it's a little light that you can cut similarly to how you would in a theater, but this is probably smaller than most theater units. So maybe for some weird narrative reason, I want to add an accent there. So you've got those kind of typical film lights that you might think of. You do also have kind of a film equivalent of a smart bulb. So it's a little bit bulkier than a regular smart bulb, but this can actually do all sorts of colors and not just different color temperatures, which actually, for those who don't know what color temperature is, I will briefly demonstrate. What you think of as white can, in film, be anything from this, so look at that little patch, from this to this. This is technically all white. They're just kind of different kinds of white. So color temperature determines what actually is white. And you kind of have to calibrate your lights and your cameras for that. That's a longer discussion that we won't be having today. But using a smart bulb like this allows you to actually manipulate that color temperature. And maybe you want to create some contrast between this light and the lights in the back. And actually, even these days, even if you buy a regular light bulb on Amazon, it will tell you what color temperature it is. So you can, to a degree, manipulate these things with traditional lights as well. You might just not have as many options.
And that's your warm through your cool. So your warm being that yellowier look and the cool being that really icy white. Because it's the tone of that warmth or that blue almost.
But here's the thing. So I'll have to step behind the camera for this, but I am not needed for this a little bit. So right now, I set it kind of with the lighting that I have in mind, but I could actually completely break it. So this now, somewhere around here, should completely neutralize all the lights that are in shot, and it's kind of this really white. I can also push it the other direction.
So that's the very warm.
Yeah. So I'm changing the settings in the camera right now, but let me go back to this point. And I'll do a demonstration that would really annoy my flatmate. Because these lights do actually have a party trick of their own. So normally we have them like this, but you can also change the color temperature like that. So you can actually have like a creepy cold look. And we obviously only have them like this most of the time because they're a lot prettier.
And then obviously there's the kind of look and feel of what you're making
Yeah.
your theatre or your film or your digital theatre. But then you've also got like the narrative elements. And I know traditionally we'd work with lighting designers to kind of create these vibes, these mood, or maybe directors. As creatives at home, it's a whole different ball game, but a good one. You get to play with this. You can still work with all those people. You're just working with very different sets of tools. For me, Poundland sells like a £3 ring light. So that's the kind of ring light that you can clip onto your phone or your laptop. Mostly a lot of the cheap stuff is that kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not halogen, it's the opposite. Is it halogen? It's the really bright, eco-friendly white, not so warm.
Eco-friendly white.
It's the, you know, the eco-friendly lamps that are really, really cool colored. I think the word is halogen. I'm looking.
Maybe. I mean, there are halogen bulbs.
There are halogen
not
bulbs, and so, but also I've used like desk lamps. So any
Mhm.
lamp with a bendy arm, floor lamps that bend as well. You can have a lot of fun with it and just kind of move it around and shape it. So there's lots of ways that you can do it. The range with light is always a great one in the kitchen. So there's lots of different
And-
things you can do still at home or in different spaces without
to be
going to buy
honest,
film kit.
Everyone has at least a few moving lights. I can think of one that every single person on this call has, which is this. And
And
that
so-
can also work, especially if you're in a close-up.
Ghost.
This is on 3.
What?
3. My cable tangled around. Okay, where am I? I'm somewhere here. So I could have, and this isn't shot here, but something like that. And now it looks like I'm looking at a computer screen, when in fact I'm just getting blinded by my phone. So there are ways to improvise. And again, if you're working on a zero budget, go on YouTube. There will be help. There will be lots of help.
There are more videos about things like TikTok or getting the best lighting for Instagram or so on, or those things, which actually all can still be very useful and very free.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, there's this thing called the DSLR revolution, which I think that happened like 15, 20 years ago. Basically, Canon released a camera that could actually do decent video. So DSLRs traditionally were photo cameras, then at some point they started doing video. And when Canon released, I think it was the 5D, maybe 5D Mark II, it was suddenly good enough that amateurs could use it to make short films. And then within a few years, there were lots of cameras that were sometimes a lot cheaper than the 5D that could shoot video. And that plus YouTube becoming a thing meant that a lot of people could now make short films and had someplace to release them. But very often they didn't have much of a budget, because if they did, they could just rent a film camera and so on and so on. So they had to find ways to manipulate the image without a budget. And lighting is, in film, probably the most important way of manipulating the image, because that's how you bring emphasis to an actor, for example. That's how you can dramatize things. So it was a very important part of the DSLR revolution, being able to do lighting on little to no budget. So that's why there are all those guides on YouTube. Right. I think I've spent enough time in the kitchen, especially since we don't have unlimited time.
So as you get settled again, Bartek, Julie's popped a question in the chat in terms of what is the best type of professional light to buy for filming. So if you were going to do some professional level kit, 1 or 2 lights, and would you best place them so for filming with one camera face on? So you've got a light in the left corner in that shot, but you've currently also got a light at the moment on you in the right corner. What are you currently working with, and do you recommend it?
So I've got 2 lights here. So kind of, in general, you can think of 2 different kinds of lights in film: hard light and soft light. Most lighting in theater is hard light because you've got a light that's several meters away from your actors and nothing really in between. Whereas if you're shooting a film, you can have a huge 12-foot by 12-foot frame of diffusion that's just out of shot, that's softening everything up. And the advantage of that is that it looks nicer on skin. So sometimes in film, you will actually make light softer as you go into a close-up compared to what.
Clarify on the technicality of what is soft or hard. Is it a color? Is it a distance? Is it angles?
No, so it's the easiest way to think about it is the quality, the gradient of shadow across the face. So if you have a hard light, let me quickly see if this works. If I switch that off, make it all very moody and use my... Okay.
It's a really harsh, stark shadow.
Exactly.
So like harsh even, so really contrasting.
Yeah, so it's exactly about contrast. So if you see here where it's bright and here where it's dark, the transition between the two is really quick.
It's not that soft,
because this is a tiny point of light. Whereas this, let me actually add another party trick so that I can show you what that is, because that will illustrate the difference pretty well.
And yes, Bartek has spent about 3 straight days setting up said party tricks and said cameras and angles and switches and notes and so on.
Open call, blah, blah, blah. I'm basically going to connect my phone to this whole thing and use it as a camera.
Why not?
Because that will be easier.
And just to say though that if you know, connecting this level of camera setup and your phone suddenly, Bartek, this is kind of medium to fairly professional grade stuff. This isn't, I can just learn to do this on the internet. You have done a bit more above and beyond that to set up something quite like this. Am I correct? I just don't want to scare anyone off in thinking.
I mean,
there's varying degrees, but.
So most of the stuff that I'm talking about today is actually pretty simple. It's just that there's a lot of it because we're covering a lot of different topics. So like hard light versus soft light. Okay, so this is now my phone acting as a camera. So this is what's lighting me. And this is like 1.5 meters across. And that basically, because it's a larger source, you can think about each point of this being its own source. And that's what makes the shadows softer, because you've got light coming from multiple different angles. And this isn't even the biggest softbox. There are like much bigger ones, but I wouldn't be able to fit that. And then if you look towards my kitchen, so that light above the island is what was lighting me there. And
Same
again,
kind
it's
of
less hard,
softbox setup.
although smaller.
Yeah.
And that also had a grid, whereas this one, for example, doesn't.
And so the one that you also then had one that looks more like a theater light as well in the corner.
The one that I was showing in the kitchen.
Colors.
Yes. So that was that would give you hard light, but you can put modifiers on it. So actually, let me go once again here. So if you look at how this light is built, there is actually a small unit at the back, and then there's the softbox. So if I took the softbox off, this soft light would become a hard light because it would change into a point source.
So if someone was to look to go, I'm going to do some filming and I'm actually going to do, and this kind of almost segues into kind of things we can and can't do with our phones and cameras.
Yeah.
And I hope that everyone noticed.
That's 3 sections later.
Well, Bartek, you got to be flexible here with me. But, you know, I think...
I need to copy and paste some of my notes.
I think everyone will notice the drop in quality of now this kind of very pristine looking vision, which is you on a professional grade camera versus the photos, the film that we just saw from your phone. But if someone wants to go, look, I'm actually going to invest in some film equipment, I'm going to get some lighting equipment. Are you recommending one, two, multiple? What can we do? Where do you
I
best
think
place them? Or is it going to be a per job kind of scenario?
most of the time it would be per job. So most of the time, if someone who does film owns lights, they kind of own some kind of an interview kit. Because if you own lighting and you're doing film, then either you're shooting interviews for people or you're a gaffer. So you basically do lighting. You don't deal with cameras, you don't deal with sound, you just do lighting. So like
But
I know a
in this,
gaffer.
yeah, in this new world, I make theatre from my home now, and I have a camera, I have a DSLR and a recording kit, and I want a light. Is there kind of a one answer, or
If it depends on two things. How often do you do it? So that's why I was mentioning who owns lights.
of course?
So
Yeah.
is it actually financially sensible for you to own lights? And if you do it often, maybe you're an actor and you do theater, but you also need to film self-tapes.
Yeah.
Great. If you can light them well, it might seem like it doesn't matter for a self-tape, but if you make it look a little bit better, people will pay a little bit more attention, and those things do help. So if it makes financial sense for you to buy lights, then if you're mostly kind of doing stuff that's a little bit like this, it's like it's just you to the camera, I would focus on soft lights. And you can buy really cheap soft boxes that look okay on Amazon. And like there's this kit that's made by multiple companies that is basically like every filmmaker's first light kit. Okay, let's drag this here and switch to this. So something like this. So if you go into any kind of a film society at a university and they haven't really bought any proper kit yet, this is what they will usually have. It doesn't look fantastic, but it does the job. So like honestly, if someone was asking me what lights should I buy for self-tapes, this is what I would mention, because it's good enough. It's not amazing, but it's good enough. And the fact that these soft boxes, these are about the size of that softbox that I had behind me, they'll be enough for like a close-up or a mid-shot. If you want to light some kind of a show that you're setting in a flat, then it's kind of more of on a show by show basis, on a room by room basis. Like I actually had a completely different idea for lighting this yesterday, and then I changed it all. So at that point, you would basically start the conversation with the lighting designer. But if it's for simple stuff, then a kit like that will do a fair bit. And it also means that you then have choices between hard and soft light, because you can take the softbox off and you'll just have the bulb, but also you can buy light bulbs. You probably have a lamp in your house with a light bulb. You've got a hard light that you can use. And like I mentioned earlier, light bulbs will usually have color temperature listed. So this softbox, this is 5500 Kelvin, which is daylight, so it's colder. But if you wanted, for example,
LED. It wasn't halogen. LED was the word I was looking for earlier,
okay.
Bartek. LED, which is often that really white.
But this one is warm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So all the lights all the non-film lights in the kitchen are LEDs, but they're pretty damn warm. Yeah. So yeah, can buy that, and if you're kind of
3000 Kelvin, just in case
which is warm.
Very
kind
warm.
of anything. Let me
And
see.
you can Google the old
Yeah.
heat light temperature. I'm just
Let's
aware
see
of
if
time,
this will.
Bartek, that we're
Okay.
approaching 6:30, and I reckon
Oh,
we're only 2 to 3 sections through that we were envisaging.
I will very quickly show this image in that case,
Perfect.
just to clarify it. So this kind of shows you how it changes. So these are the Kelvin values. So it goes from warm to cold. The higher the value, the colder it is. So the bluer it is. Right.
So I
In
just
that
wanted
case,
to just check in because I know that I'm hoping everyone's bearing with us at the moment. Does anyone need a quick screen break? I know everyone's got their cameras off and so on, but if you need a quick screen break, tea break, loo break, I just want to give everyone a minute or two to do that. So I was going to suggest if we come back at 6:35-ish and we rattle through as much as we can, just so everyone's got a moment.
can I just say two more sentences while we're in this section?
I
Because then
guess
I can
so.
close off this section.
Okay,
So,
2 more sentences and then a quick break.
so this is actually kind of going back to what Hilmi said, that the band was pre-recorded for his show. You can do that. You can also, if your neighbors are very, very understanding, have a band in a separate room. I mean, obviously, it depends on how much space you have and what the band is. You could have them, you can wire it all into an audio interface wherever your base station is. And you saw me kind of splitting this single space up into by having some cameras here, some cameras there. You can also run the cameras to a separate room and again, connect it all together. Does depend on the budget, the cables, etc.
Oh, I agree, Hilmi. Hilmi's just saying that active
yeah.
kind of active musicianship would work great for digital musicals.
Mm.
I'm with
If
you
you see me
there.
squinting, that's because I'm looking at a
Reading the
TV
screen.
that's really far.
Oh, and we've all talked about all the digital musicals we could make and so on. And I think there's lots of opportunities there. Were they your 2 sentences, Bartek?
Yes.
I just want to make sure everyone gets a
Yes.
moment to step away. So I'll pause the recording in a second and we'll just have a quick 5-minute screen break. If anyone has feedback or questions or things they want to pop in the chat or directly to me, they can. But if we reconvene here at 6:35, just in case anyone needs a stretch to come back, we will be back in about 5 minutes and the recording will pause here. All right, Bartek, how fast can we rattle through the remaining sections?
We'll find out.
Let's find out.
So to add to the previous stuff, there are 4 lighting brands that are worth looking into that are at least within the context of film budget friendly. There's Godox, that's Godox, Aputure, Aputure, Falconize, no, Godox, not Gogox. Ooh, I can actually type. I can type it in. Godox, Aputure, Falconize, and SmallRig are now doing some lights that should be budget friendly, although they're not really a typical lighting company. But the 3 earlier ones are lighting companies, and so actually this light up here is an Aputure, and the one above me in the kitchen was a Falconize. Falconize and Godox are cheaper. Aputure is a little bit more expensive, but better. But they're still not like in the realm of the super expensive film lights. Although Aputure is kind of making bigger and bigger units. Literally, every new product they release is bigger and brighter. Right, so that's that about lights. So the next practical example that everyone's very familiar with, so I'll just mention it very, very briefly, are remote feed shows. So basically, whenever you see people on Zoom, or this isn't actually Zoom, which I'll talk about in a moment. So whenever you see people connecting remotely through their computers in kind of a setting like this. So this is what I mean by the remote feed shows. So I'll basically just give a few quick tips and then move on. Tip number 1 is don't use Zoom. Zoom sucks. So basically, quality in Zoom is low by default. Enabling it can be very annoying. I'm specifically talking about video quality here. Sound quality, you also need to tweak things, but it's a lot easier. But video quality, unless you literally email Zoom support, you will not get high video quality. There's also very little control over how things look. So, for example, going back to this, which was the little scene that I created earlier, I can, if I want to, move things around or even stretch them and squeeze them and move them however I want, or even crop them. You can't do that on Zoom, and it might be useful for your show. Maybe you want to squeeze more people in while making good use of making good use of space. Right. Oh yeah. Also, you can do this little cool transition, which is called a merge. Right. So also recording in Zoom. I will get to what we should use in a moment. Recording in Zoom is unnecessarily annoying because Zoom records it in a very weird way, and then you have to convert it and blah, 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 blah. It's annoying.
It's also a really small file size. It's a bit odd. So for example, this recording, despite running for 2 and a bit hours, when I go to upload, it will take 5 minutes. So we've got a question on what we should use instead, which we'll come to, and best mics,
Right
and
now.
so audio as well. So
I will show you exactly what right now. So this, also, am I spotlighted or are you spotlighted? Because I can see you on full screen now. Just to make sure.
let me turn the spotlight back on.
Okay. Okay. Yay. So this is one example of what you can use. This is what I've been using for all the live streams for the last 2 years now. It's called vMix. Let me just put that in the chat. vMix. So this is paid, although they have kind of created a subscription option. Until a year ago, it used to be that you had to pay for it kind of in one lump sum, which could add up to quite a bit if you were getting the most expansive version. But right now there is a subscription option, which I think is $50 a month or something like this. I will mention a free option as well in a moment. But while we're looking at vMix, the reason why I use this is that I can basically drop in all the different elements here. So you saw me kind of dragging things in earlier and then creating all those different things. I can do it very, very quickly in here. And this is still my phone's camera, although it's frozen now. I can do all those manipulations very easily. I can basically build up different scenes, and I can even squeeze things like this in a weird way. So you can do lots of creative stuff with this. It basically has a lot of built-in functionality on the image side of things. Even this little headline thing, this is built in, or you can build your own. They provide you with a little tool that does this. And it has a built-in audio mixer. And I can actually wire up. Settings do take a moment to load. Different outputs. So I can, if I'm doing a show in a venue and I need to bring a caller in and then output their sound to the PA system, I can wire it all up here. I can also have a lot of different audio inputs, and then I can manipulate those audio inputs. So there's a ton that you can do with this. And the thing that I used here is called vMix Call, which is a built-in calling setup, and then you just connect through your browser. So I literally created this and sent a link to myself, which I then opened on my phone, and suddenly my phone is a camera. It does also have some...
This is the paid version, isn't it, Bartek?
Yes.
So this is quite a sophisticated tool, but if you want to do a lot of things, you could pay for it.
So this is kind of... let's see. All right, it won't do it on... This one, will it do it on me? I'm kind of trying to rush through it a little bit. Ah, yeah. So I can actually tweak the image. And I've used this a lot for remote colors. Because obviously all of their cameras will just do automatical stuff, and it won't necessarily look good, it won't match, so I've frequently applied some corrections to that. So this is paid, and this is kind of like as far as you can go with software solutions. If you go a step beyond that, you're looking at hardware solutions and like OB trucks and stuff like this. So this is the high end for pure software solutions.
What is
but
an OB truck, just for those of us who may not
outside
know?
broadcast.
So like a studio setup, some sort of
Exactly.
transportable studio.
Yeah. So it'll be a truck with like desks with racks full of equipment, and you can literally have 3 people sitting in the back of the truck operating show.
This is
stuff
probably
like
our
that.
most tech savvy option if you're going to pay for something that's portable and can be done on digitally and so on. Yep.
Exactly. And if you're not interested in investing in too much equipment, which obviously I did invest a little bit, like an audio interface and so on, but you can get a really good audio interface for, I think this one was like £150 and has something like 16 inputs, 8 outputs. So you can do a lot with that.
Audio interface. So that's
audio
where
interface,
our audio comes into the editing
yes.
suite, basically.
Yeah, so normally, unless you're in a laptop that got rid of the headphone output, you can think of that headphone output as your only audio interface.
Yep.
I have a separate unit that connects to the computer through USB and basically gives me a lot more inputs and outputs, and it also gives me the option to change my volume like this with a knob.
Perfect. So I'm just mindful that we're getting into audio, but we've got 15 minutes of our suggested time, lots to cover, and also some time for questions, of course.
So because I talked about a paid option, this is a free option, OBS Studio. It works on Windows, Mac, Linux. It's absolutely awesome. Like, it should not be this good while being free. Like, the people who work on this are absolute heroes. It does have some issues. It's designed with a different environment in mind. So vMix is designed for an operator to be running the show. OBS is designed more for someone streaming their own thing. Like, let's say I'm playing a game and want to stream it on Twitch. Because of that, it has some limitations. For example, audio monitoring is not actually done at the very end of the chain, which means that there is a possibility that your audio will get completely destroyed and your audience will hear that, but you won't. But they're minor issues. Like, there is no reason why someone who can't afford to spend money on software shouldn't be using OBS. And in fact, if you're just starting out, you should download OBS. And then if you need more, if there are things that are getting in your way, then you can invest more money. But one important thing, use OBS Studio, not Streamlabs OBS, because they're evil, blah, blah, blah. Long story. Right. So yeah, software like this, you can then run it into Zoom like we're doing now. You can run it to YouTube, wherever you want. But this is kind of your control room for everything. This is what everything feeds into and also out of. Right. So
I think, Julie, so OBS Studio and DaVinci are 2 different things.
Yes.
And let me guess if I've got this right, Bartek. So DaVinci Resolve or DaVinci 17, which we've just shared before, is an editing of videos kind of thing. It's about editing your video and making your video finished or beautiful.
You're 90% right.
And then OBS is broadcasting. How did I do?
Yeah, I would say that OBS is more streaming because broadcasting makes it kind of seem bigger than it is. But OBS
DaVinci's about getting the product right before I put it somewhere else, and the OBS is about putting it somewhere else.
Yeah.
Is that right?
So yeah. DaVinci actually started as just a coloring program, and then it just grew. So now it kind of does all of the post-production stuff, but doesn't stream.
if we were to think of it, so DaVinci would be something like your iMovie or your Windows iMovie Maker or movie player, and that
Yeah.
editing, the putting together of your film or theatre. And
It's
then
better than
OBS,
iMovie.
of course it is, but I'm just making sure everyone gets it. And then so you've got like your OBS would be, instead of streaming via YouTube or Zoom, but it's the broadcast control panel that plugs into the things and makes it the best version.
Yeah. And you can also use vMix kind of for controlling stuff in the room and on the live stream. Like,
of course,
I could talk for 5 hours just about
and I
that
think
software.
it is also a good thing to note that so Bartek has been doing this for a while. There are other people who are doing this as well and in this space. I am sure that if you have questions really specifically or need a quote or a help or so on, I do also know so Bartek does a lot of work across music, film, theatre, and so on. And so all the rates that he quotes for theatre, and especially musical theatre, are at an additional discount anyway. So if you do need someone to kind of go, actually, I need a hand to do this, there are lots of people hopefully who can help and share. But we have 11 minutes and we're going to do as much as we can. And I'm still very mindful that some questions in here earlier are a bit more about the broader stuff and the producery bits, which I might be able to answer as well. We're going to do our best.
Just so that I'm clear about this, vMix can be used for remote shows, but also for like theater-based shows. So whenever I'm in a theater and I'm streaming, it's running through vMix.
And a remote show is if you're not physically in the room, but you're controlling.
Well, no, if someone else is not. Although I can actually control vMix remotely. Again, longer story, but what I mean by the remote shows is when someone's calling in. For example, if, I mean, technically I'm calling in remotely to you now. So this thing is a remote show as well.
That kind of, we're not all filming in the same space.
Yeah. So a very quick point is that all of those things don't have to be separate. So you could have a theater show with an audience. The show is being streamed, and then one of the actors is in a different country and is connecting to you remotely and is seen by the audience in the theater on a screen and by the live stream audience, either by switching to his image or both of the images are overlaid in some way. So there are lots of options to combine the things. Those are not all like very, very separate entities. Those are just different tools, and you can use multiple tools. There is no reason not to. The only thing that you can, also you can have multiple people with multiple cameras each. It's just that someone on their end usually has to switch the cameras. You can do more complicated stuff, but it's more complicated. But yeah, there are lots of options. I will very, very briefly talk about a special case, which is remote concerts. Just pretty much a quick note, which is if you're doing a remote concert, so you've got, let's say, two people calling in and they are performing. Like we've mentioned before, don't have them try singing together. Physics gets in the way. The distance is literally too long for the data to travel fast enough. And two, if they're performing music, make sure that they sound good, which means not using a laptop mic, but actually routing their sound in properly. If they're just using acoustic instruments, that could mean using a good microphone and actually making sure that that microphone is selected in whatever you're using to connect to them. So in vMix, you can very easily go into the settings on the color side. So you go into the settings and you select, please don't use Sibelius backing tracks. Yes, please. I agree, hail me. So make sure that we're using good mic. If they use backing tracks, most of the time they will be on a Mac, and then they can use Logic or GarageBand to bring their mic in, mix that a little bit, bring the backing track in, mix that a little bit, and send the signal out from Logic for a virtual cable, which on a Mac is called Black Hole. On Windows, it's literally called virtual cable or virtual audio cable. It doesn't work quite as well as on Mac. It's much easier on Mac when it comes to audio. And you route that in. So you're basically using software, Logic or GarageBand if you don't have Logic, as your mixer. And you send nice, clean sound out. I will not get into more detail of that, but basically when I do stuff like that, I try to do most of the mixing on the color side and then a little bit on my side on the combined signal. Brief mention of exteriors. So I did do a show outdoors. It can be an absolute nightmare because you have things like clouds moving in and out. It may rain. The sun is going down, so it actually gets darker. I think I managed to compensate for it, but you can see that the color temperature changes. So it's kind of all very warm towards sunset, and then it got a lot colder. And the only reason why it's not darker is because I was constantly compensating for it. So you can do stuff outside. You can even get internet outside by using a 4G modem, but you need to test things. Because a 4G modem in a congested area might not be enough. The modem that I used for that particular show, which was in Reading, worked great there. I can't really use it where I am now, which is in Ealing, because there is too much congestion most of the time and just won't get me the speeds that I need. But it is possible. You can do shows outside. You just need to really, really think them through and just think about the limitations that you'll have and accept that there will be some issues. Right. Sound. I will very, very briefly storm through this because this is pretty important. So whenever I stream, let me actually switch to this. Which display is this?
And this is just a 5-minute warning. Of course, Bartek will try and stream through this as fast as he can.
Yeah.
I also still have written down that, I mean, I'm very happy for us to go over time. I know that others might not be, but I do want to come back to Chris and Joyce's questions earlier, as well as any other questions that people have for Bartek around techie things as well. So we're going to go through this as speedy as we can with that.
So there are two things that I always do with sound, whether I'm using my own mic or I'm getting sound from a desk. Let's say you're doing a show in a theater, there's an audience in, there's someone doing the mix, and they're sending the mix to me. Ideally, there would be two separate desks and two separate people doing two different mixes. Most of the time, that's not realistic. So that being said, most of the time, the person doing sound in a theater will be good enough to give you a decent mix. But what I then do is obviously making sure that the levels are fine, nothing is going over, it's not too quiet. I then denoise it. So I literally capture a noise print of what's coming in, and I remove that noise, and then, and this is probably more important, I compress it. So something that you have to bear in mind when you're dealing with digital theater is that your people's ears can pick up a much wider range of volume in theater than a laptop can reproduce well. And most people will be listening to stuff on laptops or maybe TVs, and most TVs have really bad built-in speakers. So you kind of need to crunch that dynamic range a bit, and that's done using a compressor. So basically all that a compressor does is when the volume crosses a certain threshold, it will crunch it down. So the loudest stuff will get quieter. So I use that to make all the sound a bit more manageable, so that the audience can actually hear both the quiet and the loud parts very well. And if you've got a little bit of noise in the system, that noise will get amplified when you're compressing, because usually I compress it above the threshold and then bring it all up so that the quiet parts are louder. So that would also amplify the noise, hence the denoiser. Literally every single thing that I stream has compressed sound, because otherwise it will just not sound great in a home setting. Okay, can we go into overtime? That's a question for Alan.
Yes, but also on sound.
Questions.
There was a question around best mics, if there's any mic advice. I don't know if that's better a question for your audio engineers or your people in the music space or anything.
It depends.
And plugging it to the computer, but
it's kind of the same as the lighting question. It depends on the context. If, let's say, you're doing a show where you're sitting at a desk and so on, then you could use a headset. Like this is, I think it's Audio-Technica BPHS1, which is a pretty cheap broadcast headset, which I quite like, and you can usually get it refurbished quite cheap. You can also use podcaster mics. There is actually a new one that I haven't tried yet, but it's from a company that I really like. Let me look it up. They literally announced it or released it a few days ago. It is... Do they even have it on the website? Oh, yeah. So I haven't even had a chance to check out any of the reviews for this yet, but this company is usually pretty good, and they mostly make filmmaking microphones, but they have come up with this USB kind of streaming podcasting mic recently. It's worth checking some reviews for this, because this might be pretty good for a setting like that. And then if you're doing something that's more of a proper scene, whether it's meant to look like theater or more like film, get a sound person. It'll be kind of, at least to a degree, similar between theater and film in that if you're miking up in theater, you're using wireless lav mics. In film, you would either use wireless lav mics or a boom mic, which is a so-called shotgun mic that will be kind of just above the frame here, pointed at you. And if you've got multiple people talking, then a boom operator will literally move that mic from one person to the other, sometimes literally looking at the script and just going, boop, boop, boop. You will frequently in film have both a boom mic and a lav mic used, and that gives you options in post, because sometimes one might work better than the other. But once you get into that, get a sound person.
And so a lav mic is a lavalier or a lapel mic. So it's the one that would clip on. I guess you could also be using radio mics. What did you call them, radio mics?
Which the ones that go on your little... lav mics. Yeah, so
a lav mic.
This will... Yeah.
It's the same kind of mic, really. Yeah.
Although you can technically use a lav mic wired, but most of the time you wouldn't. It's very, very rare.
You stick them on somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And it's kind of, in theater, you would normally hide it in hair, or maybe you would have a little headset like this. In film, you would usually have it somewhere here. Although in film, you might also hide it in hair. I hid a lav mic in someone's tie at one point. I was doing sound for a friend's project, and I was like, "Oh, the guy has a tie. Ooh, I know how to do that." And the mic was literally here.
And you put it on the pin, and you go, "Ooh, fancy." So,
so there are options, but yeah, once you start dealing with lav mics, get a sound person.
And I think especially if we're dealing with the realm of musical theatre, whether your sound person ends up being your composer or music director or someone who goes, I work in the sound space, I am a sound person, music, lyrics, but I am in the sound space. You're just going to, if I'm a words person, I'm not going to know as much about the sound space as someone who writes and lives and works in it. But I think that's where Joyce's question, which we'll come to in a moment, is really interesting about financial viability, and then Hilmi's point about what is the digital theatre and whether you're going, this is a stopgap, this is an art form, this is something else. I think there's a real element of everything's going to depend on the project and what you're looking to achieve. So we'll just whistle stop through everything, and we can do some scenarios as well.
Hey, do you want to do more questions now, or should I
Probably
storm through the next section?
how many more have we got to go? Because we're now over time. Questions, general questions.
The camera stuff I can go
Yeah.
through pretty quickly, and that's like the biggest thing. I can
Yeah.
kind of combine it with the next thing.
I think, did anyone have any questions? So Martin's got a question about servers. Did we already do best mics? So we've got the mic types, but any brands or anything you would recommend? We've done that. And the other questions were more general. So if there weren't any other questions, and I'll give everyone a moment to kind of respond or type them out or to jump on, then we might storm through cameras as quick as we can and then come and do all the really general questions about, we've got questions on platforms for streaming, servers, audience, and so on, which is, it's all big things.
The servers I can reply pretty quickly because there's very little that I know, but I also know what has been used in practice. So for Savurk, for example, so there's a difference between paid streams and free streams. If you're doing a free live stream that's open to everyone, just go to YouTube. That's the simplest, it's the most reliable. I've done YouTube, I've done Facebook, I've done Twitch at one point. Both Twitch and Facebook are annoying, they have a lot of problems. You can absolutely do it, but you will not have as easy a time as with YouTube. And also everyone knows what YouTube is, so if you send them a YouTube link, they'll immediately know what that is and not be suspicious that you're trying to steal their credit card details or something. So that's for free stuff. For paid stuff, I know that at least for quite a while, Savurk Playhouse was using Boxcast, and that's what we were streaming to. At the beginning, it was Vimeo, but there were some problems with that regarding the numbers, and I think Vimeo wanted to charge a lot of money due to the audience size. So Boxcast ended up being a lot easier. I'm not sure if they still use it, but if you ask at Savurk Playhouse, they'll probably have some insight. But I think other than the first few, all of the streams after the first few that I did from Savurk were with Boxcast, and I don't think we ever had a single problem, and their support also seemed to be very responsive.
And so for the stuff I've done, we started a Vimeo channel, so we did Vimeo OTT very early in the pandemic, so we had content up by the 25th of March. I think we shut down on the 16th, and that was also the pre-filmed kind of things. Sorry, we've got office visitors. It's so lovely, but also they'll watch this later, don't you worry. But we also then very quickly went and developed our own streaming platform, in that we went and built something else, and it's a combination of other platforms taking fees, reliability, and then access to data is the other thing that you've got to consider, that if you don't have access to the data in terms of ticket buying and so on, that you there's a lot of considerations, not just like your server speeds, your video quality. Obviously, if you're doing a video product, that's going to be one of the biggest ones, but you then also need access to the data that's come through the box office. You need access to contact details, marketing. There's a lot of factors that go into this as well. And then I know Alex has popped a question in there about color balancing. I don't know if you want to whistle stop through cameras and come back to questions, or we'll do that one.
What is that question? How do you color balance across different cameras to ensure consistent color? So I will make one important point on that, and we'll kind of cover some of that later. Try as much as possible to have the same cameras, because basically different manufacturers have different so-called color science, which is how they interpret the color the light that's coming into the camera, how they interpret that for display. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but the simplest thing is get the same cameras as much as possible. There are some tricks that you can use to make cameras match, and they can work very well, but they do require specific cameras and a little bit of time. Right, so cameras.
So Bartek, say, you know, I was like, I'm going to film this thing and I'm going to do it on my phone, versus I was going to do it with a good camera and my phone, or I was going to do it with many good cameras. Tell me more.
So I will start with the good cameras, because that will set the scene for the phones. So there are several technical parameters that describe the image that is captured by a camera. The one that everyone's familiar with, and also in many ways the least important one, is resolution. And I say this as the guy who constantly records in higher than 4K resolutions and exports everything in 1080p and 4K.
And
it's
I know
still the
this
least important thing.
because I receive Bartek's files and it takes me 4 years to download them. But they're great quality.
Yeah. In general, it's better to have a lower resolution file that's in every other way higher quality. I wouldn't go below 1080p, so the so-called full HD, but you can. And I did actually at some point run a number of crazy tests about what looks good, and I was able to get to half of 1080p. So like the drop from 4K to 1080p, drop again, and if you maintain if you maintain high quality in every other way but drop resolution, you still get a really good image. And I'll explain why the other parameters are very important for theater in a moment. So I did briefly mention dynamic range in the context of sound earlier, which is you go from the quietest to the loudest sound. There is also dynamic range for the image, for brightness specifically. So if I figure out which screen my mouse is on and switch to this, and let's actually go here. That'll be the easiest. This little thing here, which I think I can pop out. This is VectorScope, and this specific type is the waveform. It literally shows you how bright different things are. So everything here, this kind of goes left to right with the image. So everything that's on the left here is on the left in the image. But down to up is the brightness. So since everything here in this slice is dark, everything is dark here. But then here, we've got the brighter shoulder, which is somewhere here, and then this side of the face, which is the brightest. This is here. So everything from 0 to 1023 is kind of the full dynamic range of the image that we're looking at that can be used. Let me pop that back in. If I were to manipulate this image a little bit and push this down below that 0 line, everything becomes black. If I pull it up above that 1023 line, you see kind of those patches of pure white, and then weird things start happening to color because it's basically out of range. It's the equivalent of sound being either too quiet when it's completely black, or being too loud and clipping when it's completely white. And this is in fact called clipping on both ends. So it's really, really very much the same as with sound. So the thing about theater is that typically lighting in theater has a very wide dynamic range. So if you look at theater recordings from even a few years back, you will very, very commonly see spotlights on faces creating this really weird washed out look because it is clipping. Even if it's not clipping completely to white, it might just clip a single channel. And I can actually display the red, green, and blue channels separately. And you can have one clipping. So right now I'm clipping the blue channel only, and the rest is fine. And it still looks horrible because one of the channels is clipped. So in theater, it's actually very easy to end up with an image that's clipped if you're using an older DSLR, which typically didn't have a great dynamic range. So the dynamic range of the camera, it's specifically a characteristic of the sensor that's inside of the camera, is far more important than resolution. Because if the image is a little bit soft, no one will care. But if everyone's faces are just completely white, that won't look good, and you can't fix that. So more and more cameras now have decent dynamic range, and you can get a good image out of them, but it's still something that you do need to pay attention to. And let me quickly drag this. So the cameras that I tend to use actually capture the image kind of like this. You can actually see that the black is all the way up here. And even if we have really bright spots, it doesn't really go really high up. So this basically gives you the maximum amount of headroom in both directions. And then you can actually tweak it. That was just me changing the so-called color science. I'll explain what's happening here later, I hope. So I can actually change it to something that looks more natural just with a click. And I still have all the data that was there before, but I'm just representing it differently.
But why, Bartek? Why? Why would I film it in something that doesn't look the same? And is that something that I would do as not a cinematographer?
Yes. For example, if you have a look here, so these lights at the top here, they're clipping. And I mean, you've got a light and shot, you won't be able to eliminate the fact that it is clipping. However, see, the problem is that the program is trying to make it look nicer, and I'm trying to kind of break the image. Because I'm trying to make a good camera look bad. Let's see if I can get... Oh, yeah. So for example, this. If you have too low of a dynamic range, these lights will start looking horrible. You'll basically have this really harsh line between... let me actually see if this is a... Oh, no, I know. It has a little clipping thingy. Is this how I do it? See, I've never really tried breaking the image intentionally. Okay. So I've kind of broken it a little bit. We'll kind of start getting weird, kind of either washed out things like this or pure white. The problem is that I shot it all well, so it's difficult.
Pixely look.
Yeah.
Where you go, you can see that something's not right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hilmi. I know that we're running over time, everyone, but I hope this is still useful. Do shout out if it is not. We will stop.
So this actually kind of shows why it's good to shoot on a good camera, because it will be difficult to break the image. I should basically find like an old recording. But I think the easiest way to describe it is if I go here. So this is actually already compressed.
But Bartek, what does this have to do with cameras?
Oh, yeah. So this is... I'll tell you in a second. Let me just finish this thought. So this is kind of what would happen on like an older DSLR or on a camera that has low dynamic range if you're filming in theater. You've suddenly got those kind of white patches here where you're clipping. And it does not look as smooth. But then let me try to simulate this on the fly. If I do it like this. So if I now start bringing this down a bit. Actually, no, I can do it like that.
Just wanted to jump in and say thank you, Joyce, for joining us as well. I will jump on to your question at the end of this recording. So Bartek and I might just keep ad-libbing a little bit. It will be a long recording, but hopefully it's really useful for everyone. So thank you. If you do need to go, we do appreciate you joining us as well, though.
So now I kind of simulated the difference between a low dynamic range and a high dynamic range camera. So in a low dynamic range camera, you'll start getting areas like this, where it's all kind of a hard clip. And this might cover an entire face if the actor is spotlit. But then in a camera with more dynamic range, it'll kind of more gradually fall in and look a bit nicer. So that is kind of a big difference. I don't really have any extreme examples because I would basically have to have a broken image to begin with. But like I said, so it's less and less of an issue. If you've got a DSLR that's a few years old, this might be a problem. So you have to be much more careful with your lighting. That means that you might have to ask your lighting designer to kind of rein things in a little bit, not have that spotlight quite as bright, fill in the darkness a little bit. The better your camera, the more dynamic range you have, the more you can fit in. And then you can play around with it in post later, like we're doing now.
So what kind of levels of camera are we saying the better? What's the better dynamic range? Are we talking
so right now
entry-level DSLRs, or what can we do?
So without getting into a much longer discussion about how certain things work, there are kind of two main things I think that are useful to know about the image. Ooh, let me get back to this. That'll be quicker. So all the images we generally see online, or all the images that we see on our TV sets that aren't HDR, are in so-called Rec 709. Rec 709 is the old TV standard. It's what we had before HDR. And most of what you consume on a computer is sRGB, which is effectively Rec 709 without getting into details. And that has a fairly limited dynamic range because TVs had a fairly limited dynamic range as well. But both professional and kind of semi-professional cameras actually record things like this. So this much lower contrast image that I showed earlier, and this is called log. So generally, you should try and look for cameras that can record like this, because that will preserve that dynamic range, and you can then move it around so that it actually looks good. I mean, here with this particular camera, things kind of happen automatically, which is very convenient. It's not always this simple, but yeah, look for cameras that can shoot log. A very common.
Oh, I know if it can shoot log.
So I can actually recommend a specific camera that is relatively inexpensive. So it costs about £1,000 without the lens, and I have two of these and two of like the higher model, and this has just about enough dynamic range to deal with theater, and it can shoot log and can do a lot of other stuff. It does have limitations, like it's not this magical thing that is 10 times cheaper than the best cameras out there, but it can do a lot. And if you actually look at it, will this description tell you blah, 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 blah? No, it doesn't. So if you go on the manufacturer's website, it will tell you what it can, what formats it can.
Like specifications, perhaps?
Yeah.
It might kind of, yeah.
So
we probably need to try and wrap it up shortly. Okay. Just because it's 20 past 7.
Very briefly, I will talk about another parameter, but basically, yeah, that's why it matters. One of the reasons why it matters what camera you're using. Another one, this is basically similar to dynamic range, but for color. This big thing here are all the different colors that the human eyes can see. These are all the different colors that a non-HDR screen can display. So in theater, you will very often have very, very saturated colors that might fall somewhere here. And if your camera can't capture them, you will just end up with a blob of blue. So for example, this camera can, this yellow outline is what that particular camera, if I clicked the correct one, I think I did, can record in. So basically, it can capture a lot more of those really extreme colors that often occur in theater, and then you can squeeze it in post-production to make it look good and to make it viewable on a typical screen. But the important thing, as with dynamic range, is that you don't lose the data if you don't have to. Because you can always squeeze it in different ways, but if you've lost it at the recording stage, you just end up with that ugly blob. So blah, 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 color gamut, blah, blah, blah. Last thing that I want to briefly mention is the codecs that cameras record in. There are the very compressed codecs like H.264, H.265. That's what you will see on YouTube, and that's usually a delivery codec, but cheaper cameras also record in them, which is not great because those files basically throw away a lot of the data, and you end up with something that's very compressed. It's slower to play back, which isn't always an issue, but it also gives you actually, I might be able to blow this up, although I tried to preserve quality here, so it might not work. No. Let's leave it as there's a lot of quality loss. Let's not get into the details.
Perfect.
And you can't really push the image around too much.
Is there an ideal codec or compression rate that we're looking for digital theatre or streamed theatre or anything?
Yes, there are two options. One is what most professional productions are shot in, and most kind of prosumer or professional cameras shoot in. It's either ProRes, DNx HD, or DNx HR. I'll quickly type this into the chat, and I'll actually send the chat to everyone this time.
Yes,
ProRes,
please.
DNx HD, DNx HR. Most of the time it will be ProRes. So most professional TV and film productions shoot in these codecs. They're very powerful, but also very efficient, but the files will be larger. And most of the time, cameras that can do that also have the ability to shoot in these flatter profiles. They retain a lot more data, they work a lot faster, you can push them around more. That being said, in my opinion, because of the specific requirements of theater, they're not actually the best option. Was this concert 4? It was. Yes, I got it on first try, I think. So in my opinion, there is something that most of the time would be overkill, but for theater isn't. So that's RAW. RAW basically means that you're sticking as close as possible to what's coming out of the sensor in the camera, and not really discarding most of the data. And all of the things that I've been doing here in this panel are only available because these are RAW files. So if I go to this compressed file, all of this is inaccessible. So now the cool things that matter for theater that allows us to do is, if I get this into a proper image. So this is a show that I did at the Bishopsgate Institute that had a lot of different colors. And the thing is, it's really difficult to dial cameras in for all the different colors. So that's kind of what we touched upon briefly when talking about color temperature. So if I want to have a really deep purple, I might not be able to have this really golden look. And if you shoot RAW, you can actually change this color temperature in post-production without there being any difference compared to if you were changing this in camera. So that's why actually very often I don't care about color temperature when I'm filming anymore, because I dial it in later when I can actually look at it at a proper computer. And that means that if, for example, well, this was supposed to be a lot more purple, I can actually dial it in to be purple. And with this particular show, I actually did that. I got the reference images that were projected, and I dialed in each song to a particular image to make sure that the colors match. And I do it without any compromise, without any loss of quality compared to if I had changed those settings in camera. And you can only really do that in RAW. ProRes will give you more room for these adjustments than H.264, but never as much as RAW. And that's why I think that's very important for theater.
But to be clear that this is now, we're getting into professional grade for filming of theatre. We're getting into quite high tech. to a
So
degree, but
that
this is now getting
£1,000
very
camera can do it.
lovely.
This used to be very inaccessible, but over the last few years it has become a lot more accessible in terms of the cost of the cameras that can do it. Like, you don't have to spend £10,000 on a camera that can do it. You can spend 1,000. In terms of the software, DaVinci Resolve is for the most part free. There is a paid version, but if you buy one of their cameras, you get the paid version for free.
Lovely.
And they honestly retain it. The free version retains 90 to 95% of the functionality of the paid version. They're very generous in that regard. And 15 years ago, you would have to spend £30,000 on the hardware to run this, because it only came with the dedicated hardware. So this is
Beautiful.
way more accessible now, which is why I think it's definitely worth knowing if you're doing theater. Because if you have anything creative happening color-wise, you will not capture it in a single pass of a camera. And this is kind of the way in which you can retain the most of that creative vision all the way until post-production.
Perfect. I'm going to draw us to a close there, just because it's 7:30 and there's just 3 of us left with you and me, Bartek. And we have
I did
covered
get for 90%.
so much ground. With so much ground, I think everyone will really enjoy rewatching this and kind of coming back to it when they can. I just wanted to check if anyone had any questions. Chris, I know, Chris has reappeared, so I will try to get to your question in a second, but if there were any others. Anyone? All right, let me see if I can whistle.
Protect us and our rights. No one will be allowed to use any kind of physical punishment like smacking to discipline us. To find out more, visit
Hello?
End physical punishment.
Hiya, lovey. Yeah.
Hey.
We're hearing a lot of stuff in the
Hearing a lot of
background.
TV.
Yeah, I'm turning it off now.
No, that's all right.
Just put it on pause. My mum's 91. She's watching the soaps.
Not a worry at all. So I thought I'd just check before I got to your question that you typed in the chat earlier. Did you have any other questions for Bartek or I about digital theatre?
No, I'm trying to get my camera working, but it won't seem to come
that's
on.
all right. So
Right, no, just basically platforms. You know, where's our audience? I've got a full, complete recording of a live show of a musical that I filmed a few years ago. It's on YouTube. It's on, all the scenes are on. Now I just want a platform. How can I share that with people that would be interested rather than just putting it on YouTube willy-nilly, you know?
So platform is a very different conversation in that we're now talking about kind of audience, market development, social media, and so on, which I know Bartek is also a whiz at. But also we're now talking in a very different space in terms of building digital audiences and reaching people.
Right.
I think it's kind of platform agnostic because it's more about all the other things you do. So you could choose to use something like Stream.Theatre or someone. They're going to help you with marketing activities, but the question you're having is actually more around marketing activities and reaching people, and is less about what platform you're using to reach people.
Okay, yeah.
But there's definitely pros and cons to all of them. I think you also had in your question, so it was about platforms, audiences. You've also mentioned something around the legal rights royalties. So I just wanted to ask, when you said this is based on a book, did you mean like a physical novel book? Or did you mean
a novel,
a book of musical?
It's a play, it's a novel, it's a film. It's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Okay, so I've had the temporary rights for a while, but now it's since lockdown, it's sort of stifled it a little bit.
And so do you have the actual rights to adapt the show for the stage in the musical context?
I did have, yes.
You did, okay. So, I mean, the thing is you cannot continue and you cannot distribute until you have retained those rights. Just because you had those rights previously doesn't mean that you still have those rights, despite the recording happened when you had the rights. You can't continue to distribute it because it's based on someone else's IP. So you should hopefully be able to go back to them and say, I'd like to kind of revisit or renew the rights or renew the option. But you would need to check that, because it is, and this is where it gets a little complicated around book rights, film rights, movie rights and so on, that you have the correct rights as well, so that you have the rights and that you've adapted your product from the correct product, because the rights are often different. So
Yeah.
for example, you've got the rights. Okay, here's a good one. So The Birds by Daphne du Maurier, which I think is technically now in the public domain, or soon will be. The stage adaptation of The Birds is based on the book by Daphne du Maurier and not the film by Alfred Hitchcock.
Got you.
Because no one's got the rights to adapt Alfred Hitchcock's work to the stage for The Birds yet. It's based on the original book. And
Sure.
that's because it's out of public domain and so on. So you just also need to make sure that when you've gotten the rights to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you have the rights to the book and that you've adapted from the book, and not, I have the rights to the stage or the TV or the movie, but I have adapted from a different source. You will run into trouble there, but you will
Is
need
this the original
rights.
play? It's the Dale
The
Wasserman play that I've been.
And so is Dale Wasserman now, are they still living? Are they with us?
No, his widow's in charge. Yeah, I've been back and forth with her for 6-7 years. Yeah,
lovely. So I think it's something you will have to revisit in order to exploit, and exploitation is just the word we use for making money. It's not about exploiting artists, but in order to do anything in this space, you will need the rights again, and you will need them ironclad, because you're talking about a fairly popular title. You will need that, and you will need that ironclad. You're also going to need to talk about territories. So the thing when we drift into the space of the online, and this is where the rest of your question was kind of around the legal, the royalties, the payments, and so on. So my work has been around where Bartek's done a lot of the filming and like the digital and how to create and stream and broadcast. I've done a lot of the admin, the building of the technology, the marketing, and so on. And this is where we're drifting a bit off topic, but it all fits in the right space. But with royalty, so there has been a drastic change over 2 years in terms of what the contract royalty payout and so on term is. And this is where, and if Joyce is revisiting the recording, this is where her question about making it financially viable also comes back into play. The thing is that when we started the pandemic, and when it was digital theatre is now a replacement for physical theatre while we work out what's next, it was much cheaper, obviously, to have filmed your show in one day and then distributed it, because I've only paid the actors for one day compared to film. We're now drifting into a space where the unions are getting involved and saying, well, that's obviously not good enough, because you're continuing to make money off the distribution rights of my artist's product. And so you've got agents and unions and so on getting involved to say, actually, I want a fee, I want a percentage, or I want a higher fee up front, like a buyout, or I want a royalty on the distribution, because once again, we're talking about those mechanical and property rights. So you've got the original product, then you've got the recording, which is another product, and then you've got technically what is the creative property or the intellectual property of the performance that's within the product. IP law is really complicated, and I have been studying it for a couple of years, but the digital domain has not made it any easier. It's not so simple to say that it's cheaper anymore, because we've cottoned on to going, well, if I was to continue to stream James Corden in One Man, Two Governors, which was the first national theatre to come out, and continued to make £1 billion, which was for free, I'm still using James Corden's brand, image, performance, the things that do belong to him in his essence and his moral rights as to who he is, his intellectual right of the performance that he created. But the thing that I'm exploiting is the recording, which is owned by the National Theatre. And so this is where it all just gets very complicated, in that there is no hard or fast rule in this space so much, but the rule is do what is fair and reasonable, go by the union guides. If the unions have put out appropriate guides, do not take the piss too much. I've also produced 3 cast recordings, and cast recordings are even less regulated in this space. And so when we're talking about cast recordings and so on, there is no rule to follow. There is no fixed rule. The only rule is that you must pay to a minimum of the musician's union rate and so on. And so for a buyout, considering you make 0.03 pence per play of over 45 seconds on Spotify, we're talking you make no money then a royalty isn't worth it. So there's a lot to consider. And the thing is that you do need to think about your audience, your marketing strategy, your quality of work, the rights. It is one of these questions that I can't answer just as is for you. But
I think you've done very well.
This is what I've been doing for 3 years now. I produce festivals, conferences, events, roundtables, theatre.
Wow.
We did a Zoom
Yeah.
play, we did a Zoom reading, we then did a show where we filmed the entire thing on iPhone 8s, and we drove the iPhone 8s all across the country with green screens and so on. Like we've done it all between me and the 700 jobs that I do. So there's no hard or fast
Fantastic.
answer, but
No.
you do need to make sure you are not. My rule is don't take the piss.
Yeah.
And also just don't exploit people to the point where it's not fair. Be fair, don't take the piss.
Of course. Of course.
You know.
It's not in my nature anyway
Of course.
to exploit people.
No one in the new musicals field, I don't think, is of that way.
No.
No one in our community is like, I'm just going to do that.
Okay.
But that's where
Well,
I
thank
think,
you very much for that.
No,
But
of
we're
course.
almost there. You know, it's still open. It's just that lockdown and all that's put a stop to a lot of things. And
Of course.
I'm the only person that's ever had the rights to do the musical version. Nobody else has got that.
Well, now
But,
that they've lapsed, though, you need to go and check very quickly.
Got to get it back, yeah. And you said it's
You also,
important.
you may not be able to get them back. You do
No, I
need to
know.
get them back.
Yeah,
But it's
yeah.
also important that if you're adapting the play, that you have the rights to the play. But if you've been dealing with the estate of the author, you
Yeah.
should have the correct rights. You do need to
Fantastic.
talk territories as well if you're talking an online recording, because it could be that you have the stage rights to adapt to the musical, but you do not have them universally or globally. You have them in the UK or the
Yeah,
Europe,
just in
which
the-
means that I can be in Australia also adapting a musical version.
Mhm.
And especially if you're in the digital space, whether that's considered competing or not, you just need to check the terms of all of this.
Fantastic. Thanks so
Just
much. Yeah.
clarity on terms.
Okay.
And timing. How long do you have them? And is it an option or a license? What do you owe them? If you are going to distribute it, you do need to pay them.
Yeah. Yeah. We
It's
had all
kind of
that in the contract, but there we are.
Beautiful. Then you just need to kind of renew that.
Yeah.
So there you go. So there's my whistle stop 20-minute lesson
Thank
on how
you.
to do rights.
I
But
was
that
hoping
is
I could get away with putting it on
you know, it's still relevant.
YouTube.
No, you can't. And also,
That's
it's
okay.
very tricky. But I think this is also leading into Martin's question about what is the best way to do the stream. Martin, do you
Yeah.
mean by platform, or do you mean by like to watch, receive, or to output?
Yeah, we're probably going to film The Crooked Spire when we do
Lovely.
it. But the theatre, I was originally thinking of streaming it directly from the theatre, but their Wi-Fi is so rubbish. I just wondered if, yeah.
This is where Bartek and I are going to disagree.
Ah,
This is where
oh,
Bartek and I are going to well, actually, we might agree. I don't know. My gut sense is always that I would rather a higher quality recording that is correct and that is useful, that I can distribute later, than trying to live stream and goofing it up, basically. That's my
I
gut
agree.
take. I would
I agree
way-
with you completely.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Just so, and look, with all the love in the world, if we take Beam as an example, where we had the filmed and then we had the live streamed. When you do a live stream, generally the recording that you have, and this isn't the same way that everyone works, but if you're recording sound off the desk and into your cameras and so on, and you're live streaming it out, is that the only recording you're taking? Because if that's the only recording, if you're not also additionally recording what's on the desk, additionally recording and saving the video capture, then if something goes wrong with that live stream recording, that's the only recording you have.
sure.
And so this is where I know we had issues on the day for Beam, and I don't mind using such an example where it wasn't actually until after the event had happened, but all the mics and everything was on in the room. Everything was working. We had mic problems across the day, and we didn't realize that one of the mics in the afternoon session for slots 4 and 5 or something, one of the mics that was patched through to the desk was in the room, was not going through to the camera, which means it wasn't going through the live stream.
Infuriating.
Means there's a missing camera. And for me, we obviously learnt, and we've gone and had to go, well, we now need to fix it. How can we fix it? We've edited it as much as we can. But if we don't have that original recording that was good quality in the first place, I can't just magic it up.
Sure.
So I think for me, I go, if you are going to, if you already know the Wi-Fi is not good, I would way rather focus on getting a really clear, high quality video. This is where Bartek's mentioned you've got live stream or video on demand. And they're two different things technically, but for me, I go, am I watching live or am I watching on demand? You can still have a pre-recorded video that you release as a premiere, that you have a watch party for, that everyone watches together, and it is live. And then after that stream has finished, you can replay it at any time. But that still can be pre-filmed, and you can still release that on YouTube, and you can still monetize that. But you have the high quality product, which you can do anything you want with.
Yeah, we're looking at Stream Theatre. So that's
Stream.theatre will only be able to work with the Wi-Fi that you've got, though, unless you bring in additional. Stream.theatre will take
as
your
a
pre-filmed,
delayed,
though. Yeah,
film
absolutely.
version.
Yeah. And so
In
that's where
another
this-
situation, is there a? Did you say 4G or something, Bartek?
Yeah, but that is tricky. So, actually, let's take a step back. Wi-Fi. Never ever use Wi-Fi. Because here's
You'll
the thing.
overload it.
It's not even that. Wi-Fi is fine for watching Netflix or doing stuff at home, but Wi-Fi is inherently less stable than a wired connection. So you should always, if you're streaming and there is an audience, as in watching the live stream, you should always, unless there is absolutely no other choice, use a wired connection. I've only ever had one Wi-Fi connection that I felt comfortable using for streaming. Everything else should be wired, because it's not just about speed, because you can have very fast Wi-Fi, but it's inherently less stable. I did one remote show where I had someone calling in, and when they were calling in over their Wi-Fi, it was unusable. Like, it wasn't bad, it was literally unusable. The moment they plugged in, it was, yeah, that's absolutely fine. It was the same internet connection.
So if you're in a building, that doesn't have any internet connection,
It must have one somewhere.
It will have
It will
to.
have it somewhere.
If you have Wi-Fi, you have internet. When we say
Yeah.
cabled, we mean you need to plug into the modem, into
Yeah.
the wall, into the,
okay.
and that's what we did at Hackney Empire with Beam. So we did have Stream.theatre do the streaming. We absolutely were plugged into the wall. We weren't relying on Wi-Fi or connection,
Sure.
especially if it's a public connection. Like, I mean, I can't stress enough, never do it over Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
You can have all the best downloads in the world, but also if your uploads aren't fast enough, your video will never buffer. It will never be good. It will never be done. But you do need to be then mindful of people who can access that. So if someone then goes, oh, well, we're all gonna connect to the Wi-Fi during the show, and our phones are gonna run updates, it's gonna bomb your connection. Like, you cannot take the risk.
And even if
Ever.
they're on a different connection,
If it's still
you
the
have a
same
lot of
account.
traffic within that same frequency range in the room. That can absolutely affect you, especially if the channels are close. Channels are basically sub-frequencies, and if the network is not configured well, you can have channels that are right next to each other, and a lot of traffic here will interfere with the other Wi-Fi.
Think about it like a football game or a massive event or the Olympic opening ceremony where you all go there and no one's phones are picking up any reception. Just because there's way too much going on that the whole area is like, nah, we have no idea what signals are coming in and out. There are way too many. There's too much interference. Can't be done. So I would definitely err towards beautiful filmed, think about it later, focus on the quality, because then you have options and you can make your marketing material. I think where you're saying part of Chris's question earlier about finding online dedicated audiences and then using someone like Stream.theatre is they have an existing audience, mail out, brand. You're not doing that audience building, but knowing you yourself, Martin, and your show, I know that you've been working on this show for a while. You will have data, you will have audiences. You aren't starting from square one. You also know to put it in the Friday mail out and, you know, social media and so on. But when you're looking at like providers or platforms and you're trying to find audiences, that's obviously one of the considerations. And then obviously fee. So how much are they going to charge you for the box office?
Yeah, and you certainly earned your supper tonight. But I have one slightly very quick one, hopefully.
Of course.
Have you come across the Difference engine? It's
I know
for
this
captions.
name. Yes.
They use it for captions on the phone, and that again uses Wi-Fi.
Again, is that
I'm-
because you're looking to live stream though? So Bartek put me onto software. Oh God, what's it called?
Rev.com.
REF.com.
But that's after the fact.
That's after the fact. You upload
Yeah.
your recording and it captions it, and you can go and correct it.
Captions are a bit of an annoying topic. So the first question is, what exactly are you trying to do?
Exactly, because is it live or is it after? If
this would
live
be live, yeah.
streaming,
Live.
The captions would be
Stage
live.
text.
Live and burnt in, or do
Oh,
you want to be
God.
able to switch them on and off?
The
Because
Difference
everyone-
engine does it presumably burnt in. I don't know. No, it's not.
Is that for
burnt
the
in,
phone
but
though? Is that for this?
It's on the
specific-
phone. Yeah, it's a separate.
So you'll need
device,
one
I
that's doing that's going to be able to handle both. And are you also talking audio description or captions or both?
Yeah, I know. It's a bit of a
And this is
minefield,
where I
isn't it?
go, I think actually the question for you to first look at is, are you streaming or not? Because then you also know if I'm not streaming, I can still, and this is where I go, am I filming live to audience live, physical or non-physical?
No, not for this
So
particular thing.
if you go,
Then
I'm
it's a lot easier for you.
filming,
Yeah,
but
sure.
I can still release it and everyone watches together, sure.
Yeah.
You can then upload your product to have it captioned. The captions can be toggled on and off.
Yeah.
They can be done better. They can be edited better. They can be burnt in or not.
I think
Everything
that's
gets
going
a
to have to
little
be
bit
the answer.
easier.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
And
can also
there are
arrange
tools
audio
for that. Like,
description. You know, there's lots of things.
whenever, so like if you go on YouTube, on any video that has automatically generated or manually uploaded captures,
Yeah, they're
you can
amusing,
switch
though,
those
don't
on
they?
and off. Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
amusing.
So, but you can upload your own.
Of
You can
course.
upload your own.
Yeah, sure.
And
sure.
basically, there are those SRT files. They're essentially just text files with each
Time
line
codes.
having a time code, when it starts, when it ends. For example, in Resolve, you can actually import that, edit that within Resolve while watching the video, export it as an SRT file, and upload it. I'm not
This
sure
is
whether
where-
YouTube will accept an SRT file that's embedded into the file, but it might.
Tricky. I think normally
Yeah.
I've uploaded separate SRT
Yeah.
files.
Yeah, and
that's just where
that works
burnt
absolutely
in
fine.
means you can't turn it off. It's embedded in the video.
Yeah.
You know, when you download
No,
if
but
you
but
click
what
you
I
download
meant by
something
embedded was
into the
so,
file. Yep.
yeah, because a file consists of a video stream and an audio stream, but an SRT stream can be a part of that as well. But I'm not sure whether
I
YouTube
think
accepts
YouTube
that.
can do it, but a bit.
Maybe
I don't know about the
upload it
quality.
separately. Don't worry.
Upload
Don't
it
worry about it.
separately.
Upload it separately. So, like
yeah.
in Resolve, you can actually export the subtitle file
Right.
from your project.
You still need to
It's-
create the subtitle file though.
Yeah.
So you still need to sit
Yeah.
there
I
and
know,
type them all
really
out.
Yeah.
Or if you send it to rev.com, make sure
They
that
do
you
it.
double check everything.
Oh,
'Cause
God,
no.
they will do amazing things, but
not well.
if someone has a strong accent, or they will miss things. They
Look,
are human.
For example, and it's not that it's a strong accent or anything, but I will then run this recording through a service called otter.ai, which is one of the live streaming, live captioning, live audio services. And let me tell you, it is going to have a whale of a time with Bartek's accent. It's going to have a whale of a time with my Australian accent, because I think it's mostly run on British accents.
Right.
Every time we had a meeting we recently had a meeting and someone said Jody, and Otter has decided that's God. And someone said Raj, and they decided that was rushes. And I'm like, that's way off. And actually it's quite a clipped. You do save yourself a lot of time if you do the automated, but you do have to correct it.
Sure.
YouTube will actually auto caption everything for you, but it will be even less accurate. But it does take time.
Yeah, it's very amusing. Yeah, usually.
And
But it can serve as a stopgap if you're doing something live. There's something there for the 24, 48 hours when you don't have the
Yeah.
proper captions yet.
I think if you really, really want the best practice or the best advice in terms of like captioning and so on, I always say stage text for the people to talk to. They are expensive. They do not get it wrong though. They do it on the fly, they do it live, and it's usually almost 99% accurate, but you pay for that. But if it's about ensuring that it's genuinely, authentically accessible to everyone, and that's what's important, then you need to budget for that as well.
Sure. Thank you.
And I think the last
Can
very, very patient question in the chat.
I just quickly
Yeah,
add
of course.
two quick notes to
Yeah.
something that you said like 10 minutes ago now? Record and stream, absolutely yes. Preludes, we recorded in camera on 4 cameras while also streaming, and then we took that recorded version, which was in a raw format, and we did a complete remaster after the fact. And we dialed in the colors better, but we also added quick effects like there's this distortion thing happening here that wasn't in the live stream. We added that after the fact and we played around with it.
This is where it's really clear. Are you live streaming, live to camera, live to audience? Are you video on demanding live? You know, and I guess those words are a bit confusing, but live camera, live stage, live camera, live audience, live stage, live camera, no audience, live stage, recording camera, you know, and there's lots of different options. And of course you can still have live audience with static camera, and we go round and round, but I think that's
mix and match. You've got a lot of different options. And the second thing about sound, this is why earlier when I mentioned OBS, I said that in OBS you can't monitor sound at the very end. So this is one of the reasons why I switched to vMix, and what you were kind of saying about not realizing that there wasn't sound going in. That's why, unless you're doing something on literally zero budget, you should always have a person who's listening to what the audience will be listening to.
And the problem for us was we had people listening to what the audience was listening to in the room. We had listening off the desk. We had listening on the live stream, but because they were in the room, it was very difficult to tell that actually it was only one microphone that wasn't coming through.
It is difficult because
unless we had a board in front of us that says that what's coming out the live stream, channel 9, nothing, no wibbly wobbly. And this is where I go, it is important to invest in these things, but also it's important to do it within budget, within reason, but also it's important to do it right. Otherwise, why do it?
If I have to be in the room, sometimes I will literally up my volume to an uncomfortable level and go like this just to make sure that, is there a hum? Is there no hum? Am I hearing that?
Yeah.
Because like you said, if you're in the room, it is harder.
And the thing was, we had live stream desk next to sound desk. So anything that's been called for the show is basically being called between the two of them. It's very difficult. I think we're all still learning in this space as well, and we're all getting better. And it's also about digital or live stream stage management as well as us learning and things like, you know, one of the notes I wrote down is, oh, good God, working with the director of the live stream versus the director of the product on stage. And where Hilmi's points about whether actually it's one thing or it's two things, well, then you have two directors, you know, so Bartek being the director of like photography and cinematography versus what I want to see on stage. If they clash, you've got a problem. So there's a lot to consider. And I think this is where this is stylistic, it's art form based, but it's also about the purpose to which you wish to achieve with the thing you're doing. And so if it is, I want to make a digital musical as an art form that is digital, the end, then you have your goals. If you want to achieve a recording for exploitation purpose, for money gathering or so on, or just for archive or for attracting investors or all of the above, but it's a stage product, then you have that. There's the weird gray area in the middle, but you have clear, what do I want to do? Here is what I can do within that realm, and vice versa. So I can't do film effects because I'm doing a stage product for a live stream. It's going to be a lot harder, or it's going to cost me a lot more, but it's about working within what you want to do. And I'm very aware that we've now gone an hour over time, but I think we've covered some really great things. The last question in the chat, which I think comes from a slightly tech-savvy Alexander here to say, do your suggested cameras, Bartek, integrate well with Atom Mini? So obviously
I have
he's
prepared for
listening
that.
along and clearly knows a little bit more than I do at least, but do they integrate? Tell us more.
This is me answering yes. This is an Atom Mini, and all the cameras are running through that. And then, which cable is it? This cable kind of winding around here is going here into the back of the computer down there. So yes, they're made by the same company. So ATEM Mini was designed with these cameras in mind. That being said, there are still a few bugs in the firmware, which I'm constantly afraid will cause me issues, so I have a few workarounds in place. But yeah, these cameras will work better with the ATEM than any other cameras, because there is a certain degree of communication between the two.
Is that because they're both manufactured by Blackmagic, the company that do the
Yeah.
thing?
So they're both manufactured by Blackmagic, and they were released around the same time. So I think they released the Pocket 4K, then started the ATEM Mini line, then the Pocket 6K. So they kind of happened concurrently, and it all happened when the pandemic was starting. So they kind of figured out that, oh wait, we just released those cameras that give you like low-end professional level results for consumer money. And now we release the switcher, and now everyone's streaming, so let's mash it all together.
Lovely.
And for the most part, it works well, minus a couple of bugs, which can be frustrating. And their high-end cameras, which are like £5,000 up, can also work with the ATEM Mini, but you kind of have to convert the signal a bit, because HDMI, which all of this runs on, is kind of the consumer/prosumer connection. SDI is the professional level connection, and those more expensive cameras are designed with SDI in mind. So you kind of have to do some conversion, but they made it so that if you use their converter, you can have all of the fancy communication happening between the ATEM and those cameras. But it requires like 4 cables per camera.
And at a full 1 hour overtime of super duper wisdom, thank you everyone for coming. Whether you have been with us the whole thing, we have 4 people who have been with us for 3 hours.
They should get a medal or at least a chocolate.
4
Thank you
people,
very much.
3
I think you
hours.
deserve the medal.
Potato brain. Very good. But thank you, Bartek. You have shared such wisdom and insight.
You're
and such a
welcome. I hope I didn't ramble too much.
Not too much, but it was all wise wisdom ramble on topic learning. I will circulate a recording of this to everyone. So if you got your link through Eventbrite and you registered, I will send it through that way. If you're an MMD or MTN member, it will also be in the Friday mail out. I will also respond to questions about transcripts and so on. But if anyone has any feedback or any more that they want in this space, or actually we want the lesson on intellectual property, we want the lesson on royalties and so on, please do feel free to give us that feedback. I am technically in the role for another 6 days, but I'm actually not really going anywhere. So I can always pop back in on the Zoom and do my little producer spiels, or find people who are the right people for the team to bring in to discuss. So feedback always welcomed, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's been brilliant.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
Bartek.
much, Ellen.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you all.
Fantastic.
And
Thank
thanks,
you.
Ellen.
Yeah.
Have a lovely
Bye.
evening, everyone.
Time for a
Bye.
gin and tonic. Bye.